All right. What's up, everyone? I am back. I think it's been, what, 2, 3 months? It's been a while since I did a stream. And so it's really good to be back. I had a very long break. It was much needed. So took a lot of time off. I just started blogging again earlier in the week. So the blog is back. The channel is back. Everything is back. So we're going to kick some ass this year. We're going to kick some moral realism ass and just show how wrong it is until everybody's moral anti-realist, even though that's probably practically irrelevant anyway. So you could also see that Danny's here. So welcome, Danny. Danny, I think we were going to talk about ethics or something. But the other big announcement is that I hit 1,000 subscribers. So thanks, everybody, for being part of this tiny little community. If you are part of it, I know some of you are in the comments that are in there a lot. So welcome back, everybody.
When did you hit 1,000? When did you hit 1,000?
It was a couple days ago. I didn't even keep track of exactly when it happened, but I got some like emails saying like congrats, and so I could check the day. It was like 2 days ago. So I'm at 1,000. So everybody that's like returning, great. Anybody that's new, welcome. But yeah, so I just hit 1,000. For me, it's a big milestone because I cover such niche topics that it's hard to grow my channel. I'm not making reviews of video games or reviewing food or whatever. Maybe I should, but it's been the sort of thing that has been changing for me as the sort of like PhD fog clears from my head. Like my interest in other things is returning. So we're going to have so many more topics on here. So the blog series returning, you'll be pleased to know it's not meta ethics. I know people like meta ethics. I'm never going to stop with that, but it's not a bunch of meta ethics. It's on consciousness and experimental philosophy. And I'm doing something that I talked about doing for a long time that I didn't really do, which is I'm starting to get into describing some of the experimental philosophy studies and then offering some critical commentary on them. And sort of, in this particular case, I'm offering articles and then other published articles that are critical of the methods. So I'll be describing studies and talking about studies. So I'll be getting into some of the empirical stuff too. So that's covering, it's called the folk philosophy fallacy. It's a 5-part series. It's all written already. So you're just gonna have to wait till all of it comes out. There'll be like a version at the end where it's like everything at once. So that's going to be like a whole month of different parts of it coming out. And what I'll be doing is talking about this claim that some philosophers will make that they'll say, most people have a concept of phenomenal consciousness, or they think that they have quality. And I'm examining the empirical case for that. And I can just tell you, spoiler now, same thing I'm going to argue in so many other cases. I don't think there's a definitive answer whether people do or do not have a concept of phenomenal consciousness, like non-philosophers. I suspect that they don't, but I don't think it's because they like have some folk theory that's like anti-qualia or like physicalist. I think that they don't have any particular view at all, but they'll have to see what I say about the studies and all that stuff as it comes out. Anyway, so Danny, you're here. I don't want to take up too much of everybody's time with you.
Well, first of all, the link is you posted the link to the StreamYard link. Is that right?
Yeah.
Yeah,
should be.
So I don't know if you meant that because as an invitation for anyone to come up.
Yes.
But I think that should, it's a celebration. So we don't want just two of us celebrating.
Sure, but I think you had some questions for me. So we will get to that. But yeah, but thanks, Danny. I'm terrible at keeping track of everything. Mm-hmm. So I posted the link. This is a day where people can come up and join and talk to me if you want. You could throw questions at me, congratulate me, tell me I suck and you hope I lose 1,000 subscribers, whatever it is. But we'll do that, I think, after Danny and I talk about whatever it is, and then we'll open up the floor. But Danny, are you going to try to hit me with some gotcha questions like you did with Inspiring Philosophy, so that you make me like, and then I have to say I'm not prepared and
Not today. I think you're gonna give me some gotcha responses, so we'll see.
I don't do that a whole lot. I'm nice to people. I just had a conversation with someone on TikTok that was a moral realist, and we had a great conversation.
Who was that?
I don't. You know what? I don't know. People have weird usernames on TikTok, and I can't, because they'll have names like Lance Bush 78643232 or whatever, and I can't keep track of them. So I don't remember their username, but I thought we had a perfectly pleasant conversation. There was nobody implying the other person was an evil maniac for not sharing the same meta-ethical standards, as if that matters. You don't believe in nominalism, you're evil. Like, philosophers are ridiculous with the whole posturing and then acting like they're not posturing. But
well, anyway. That's kind of what I want to talk about. So I've noticed that whether, I guess, how you describe your normative claims as an anti-realist, can dramatically change, or the way that you're perceived can dramatically change based on what term you're using. For instance, if you use the term preference, well, I think that what I think ought to be the case is just a function of my preferences. People will lose it, right? They'll think that that's um, some kind of concession. But I've noticed that if you just replace that term with a either a near synonymous term um, or something that's still grounded in our preferences, like the notion of value. So, like, if I were to say, well, yeah, I think what I think should be the case is a matter of what I value, then it just loses a lot of that rhetorical hit that existed with the preference talk. So, like, there's a bit of an experimentation about what sort of terms you want to use if you're trying to avoid the rhetorical hits. So, like, some terms that we've used stance. So it's a matter of my stances, a matter of my preferences, a matter of my values, a matter of my judgments, the matter of my desires, a matter of my commitments. There's all these different terms, and I'm wondering, what are your, if in the context where you're, let's say, debating a more realist who does want to humiliate you, who does want to show that it's just a matter of that if you're in front of an audience that would think that just if you're saying that morality is a matter of your taste, like like, what would you do in those sort of environments? Like, what terms would you prefer to use?
So this isn't something I've thought super critically about. And it's the sort of thing that I think is in part an empirical question. That doesn't mean we need to go out and do, like, NIH funded studies with 1,000 people or a longitudinal study over the next 20 years, although that would be nice. These are the sorts of things you could learn a little bit from trial and error. So the first thing is to just say, you have to start with some plausible hypothesis. Does the type of language that you use for articulating an anti-realist perspective on moral issues influence how people react, and is there significant individual variation? So, I'm arguing with someone and they say, look, okay, so if you don't believe in objective moral facts, like what prompts you to hold the particular moral positions that you hold on something? And if I say insert term, I think you're probably right that people react differently. I think I've had this experience, but I haven't been super self-conscious of the language that I've used. I've probably used language interchangeably and in a somewhat sloppy way, but the specific words you use, first impressions matter. So the first term, if I use a bad term that's going to get a bad reaction, and I say, no, well, by this term, I actually mean this other term, I'm intentionally not giving terms yet. So I will get to that. If you try to change it up afterwards, people are going to still stick with whatever you've said first. So let's go through some of these terms. Here's some things I could say. Well, I act in accordance with my desires. People hate that. Desires. Desire has this feel of this, like, hedonistic, like, you just want to go to the sex party or whatever. And it's like, desires. I just want to go to a buffet and eat all the food. Like, it has this like sensuous or gluttonous or this hedonistic feel to it that I think makes it seem really unappealing and makes it seem like especially like it's like sinful desires. So I think that's a bad one. Preference, people really don't like, because preferences feel like the sort of thing that people immediately go, well, preferences are arbitrary. Preferences are contingent. Wouldn't like, in most like lay conversations, like, not philosophers, they're probably not going to say contingent, but they might say things like, well, your preferences could just, you could just wake up in the morning and prefer to hurt people, and then you would. So it's that contingency, that instability. It's you could just change on a dime kind of thing that I think is prompted by a term like preference. Now, I actually think that's really weird, because I know lots of people that are theists that became atheists, and atheists that have become theists. I know philosophers that have changed their views on issues. I don't know a whole lot of people that radically change their food preferences or their music preferences. In fact, I've never met a person that, for instance, loves like heavy metal and they hate country music. And then I talk to them 10 years later and they're like, I hate heavy metal and I love country music. And I haven't looked at empirical evidence on this, but I'll just say this quickly, because there's two types of strategies I think that make sense here, and I'll get to those. But One hypothesis I would have is that in many cases, preferences or we could say values, desires, goals, those sorts of things, depending on what it is, the less proximal it is. In many cases, I suspect that they're actually more stable and less subject to change than our beliefs. And one of the things that a lot of critics of moral anti-realism like to claim or imply is that part of the problem with moral anti-realism is that it leaves you with standards or moral values that are contingent and subject to changing like on a whim. And I'm not sure that that's true. I'm not actually sure if all morality was grounded in our emotions or preferences or desires, that it would be less stable than our beliefs. So there's that point. Okay, so you have terms like desire, preference, that sort of thing. What I suspect, this would be the hypothesis that I'm thinking of like off the top of my head, is that as you move so first there's going to be two major elements here. One is that terms that have some sort of technical usage like goal or desire or value, you can use them in a philosophical context with a technical usage. And if someone's reading a technical text, they might be able to suppress or forestall any sort of connotations that would be associated with the colloquial term. However, I think it's still a bad idea in practice to use terms that carry certain undesirable connotations in the context of arguing about values. So desire is one, preference is another. And so what I suspect is that there's sort of the connotations associated with non-technical uses of terms. And as you move away from ones with negative connotations and towards ones with positive connotations, that increases the viability of the anti-realist response. That's one. And the second is as you move towards increasingly technical sounding language, I think that pushes people's negative reactions out of the way. Because if I say, yeah, my moral standards are based on, like, imagine if I said this, they're based on whatever I want. That sounds really bad. If I say they're based on, because notice it's a term, whatever I want. I'm really emphasizing that it could be anything. What if I want to hurt people? Then I think it's good. If I say what I want, that sounds a little less bad. If I say what I desire, I think that's slightly less bad in some ways, maybe a little worse in others. If I say what I prefer, I think it's less bad. So, but what if you move towards something like, oh, well, I think that we just act in accordance with whatever our local utility function is. Are people going to go, oh my God, but what if your utility function is to kill people? Like they're not going to have that reaction because it sounds technical. What do you think? So I've given a few points there.
Well, also I want to talk about the term opinion. We don't want to forget that one. Like, oh, you're saying it's just a matter of opinion. And I think that with preferences and opinions and desires, it doesn't carry the connotation that we would expect other people or would want other people to have those same values. Like if I say it's my opinion that DC is better than Marvel, right? I'm not carrying the expectation or the hope that you have the same set of values or same set of preferences or so I think that a lot of this, like when we're expressing disapproval of each other's behavior or some kind of event, like we're usually hoping that other people share in those, have the same preferences or same values or desires, right? So I think that what I like to say about terms like preferences and opinions is that they're broader. I think they have a broader usage than the sense of value that we're using when we're disagreeing with each other about, let's say, how society should be run or what you're doing, right? Like I wanted to touch on that as well. So I guess the term opinion too.
Okay. So yeah, we could touch on the term opinion. That's a tricky word. And it's unfortunate that some experimental philosophers have actually used the word opinion in their research. So what do you make of the whole, because maybe you don't think this is plausible. So like various terms have connotations that will be better or worse, rhetorically speaking, in certain contexts.
Absolutely.
I think that's obvious, right?
Yes.
And then it's just a question of like, what we could do is canvas the range of terms that an anti-realist could use. And then in principle, you could test, but we could probably sort of intuit out that like desire was probably worse than value. And then, so that's one. So you agree with that. I don't even know if it's controversial. And then the other one is the more you move towards technical language, the less objectionable sounding on rhetorical grounds your remarks become.
That seems very true.
Because like, just imagine your reaction to me saying, well, I think that as an anti-realist, I don't think that there are anything is objectively right or wrong, good or bad. And personally, I do whatever I want. That sounds real bad, right? But what if I
Yeah.
say I act in accordance with whatever utility function is descriptively, like as a matter of descriptive fact, characterizes my goal states or something? Are people going to go, ah? I don't know.
Yeah, it sounds more like I don't know, like some kind of robust moral theory that is detached from like what you want to do. You know, like you might even agree that, oh, you know, deep down this is what I want to do, but I know that that we should prioritize utility or something like that. Like so there you can just be expressing competing desires and just have a second order desire for one particular set of goals to win out. But yeah, I mean, yeah, so I'm definitely in agreement with everything that you said.
So, so there's these two elements that I mentioned. One is to just be precise with the terminology. So I should probably avoid using terms like want or desire. Goal is probably better. Value is probably better. So basically, I should shift more towards technical terminology that has less negative connotations. Because if I said like, oh, well, I act in accordance with my desire states, it sounds a little more technical, but I'm still using a word with a negative connotation.
You know what I've noticed is actually, you know, the term caring actually seems to be a not too technical, but it doesn't have as bad of
like I do what I care about.
Yeah, like I care about you. I care about my family. That's what motivates me to act in the way in these sort of ways. That seems to have less of a rhetorical backlash.
That seems plausible. Yeah. So maybe people in the comments can propose terminology and then say whether they think it would have a good or bad connotation, or whether they
caring, like, you know, is so like you care about others. That's the term
nurturing.
we like
it's
to use, right? The context of caring is usually, you know, we're talking about another person. Like I care about myself is such a weird usage of the term care. Like I care. Usually, you care about something.
But you could, because and this is an important point to emphasize, which is that all of these terms, it's not like a word has a negative or positive connotation necessarily. I mean, maybe there's some words that in practice are always used in a way where they have a negative or positive connotation. But that's not always the case. And a lot of times connotation varies in accordance with the surrounding words that it's affixed to. And this just pushes the point that I frequently push, which is that, you know, words themselves, they don't really have like intrinsic meanings. I think that words, basically, I think that I really kind of reject the semantics pragmatics distinction. I think it's basically pragmatics all the way down. Mm-hmm. And I think that people just, it's like outside of philosophical contexts where people seem to be super confused about language, it seems like it's obvious to people that what people mean to me, but I don't know, that everything is super context driven and holistic, and what a person means by a word really depends on the context. Anyway, just my point here is that term care. If you just use the term outside of any particular context, I think it has a positive connotation feel to it, because you imagine in most contexts, it is used in that way that's like nurturing and other regarding. But you could have a sentence where a person says, I only care about myself and nobody else. Now care is not serving the role of facilitating a sort of positive judgment, because the surrounding words modify it in a way where now the person is using the term care to make clear how much of a selfish jerk they are.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I guess, do you want to move on to the next round of terms? So we talked about preferences, desiring, caring, I guess wanting, desiring.
Attitudes. I see in that someone is providing some attitudes, comments, goals,
commitments. Yeah, it's a matter
attitude is a weird one, because attitude has a bunch of colloquial uses, like, oh, that person has a lot of attitude, but it also has this like technical use. So
I mean, one of the and I've mentioned this to you, one of the most successful terms, kind of term that I like to use that really, like, it really throws them off the script of like, I'm going to get you rhetorically, is judgment. Because it is weird to think about rightness and wrongness without a judgment. And if we say we add the possessive, your people's judgment, your judgment, my judgment, God's judgment. Like if I'm saying I don't understand what the good or values would be independent of a person's judgment, then they're gonna have to say, well, look, there's judgments out there as independent of all these people, or all people. Then it's really hard to articulate what a judgment would even look like at that point, because we think of judging as something that we actively do rather than like discover. We don't discover, and so, like we discover, different rocks, and I don't know. So I've had a lot of success with that term.
So a lot of success in meta-ethical contexts, like avoiding.
Yeah, when they're going for you rhetorically, like we're going for you rhetorically.
Where are you having these conversations? Because mostly I've seen you on TikTok having discussions about theism. How often is the meta-ethic stuff coming up recently? Or are you just reporting just past experiences?
Well, like I have a lot of private conversations, and they, like I had a private conversation yesterday or the day before, with a theist, we're setting up a debate on Parker's channel tomorrow. So that'll be fun. Do you know who God Logic is?
No. I'll have to look them up. I'm going to be very excited. Do you know what time is it?
Tomorrow at 7 p.m. Central Time. So we're Parker and I versus him and Life and God Logic. God Logic has 100K YouTube subscribers, and he's like really popular polemicist against Islam. But I think he wants to. His friend wanted us to debate, so he set it up.
That's great. I will totally be watching that. Maybe I should. Is it going to be recorded?
It will be recorded. Yeah.
Great. Maybe I could do a review of it afterwards. That'll give me something to do on my channel.
Yeah, it's going to be on the Christian, whether the Christian God exists, but they already told me that they're going to go with moral argument. They're going to bring up morality for sure.
Yeah, we got to. On that note, we should try to figure out some way of setting up a panel or a discussion on some topic, because I think it'd be really cool to do some different formats and conversations. If you're up for it, if not,
I'm definitely up for it. But yeah, so, which sort of, I'm thinking about the terms to use, and I'm thinking about the ones to avoid. But that, which is why I'm having one of the reasons why I'm having this conversation. But I wanted to ask, I think. Definitely the notion of stance. I was wondering, I don't actually know. You've defined it for me before, but I don't remember.
I don't know. It's hard to give I'm not a big fan of definitions, because whenever you give a definition, you're sort of you're drawing a circle around a certain range of possible ways of deploying a concept. And it's always the case when you do that. Well, maybe not always, but it's frequently the case that when you do that, you're potentially leaving out things you would include on reflection, or if you were more careful or precise or comprehensive, and you're including things that you wouldn't. So like if someone says, give a definition of table, and they're just like, look, you have to, I'll give you $1 million if you give a definition. Fine, I'll give you a definition. But then the person could immediately start going, counterexamples. Here's this thing that looks like a table. Like it has this, it's made out of wood and it does all the things a table does. Other than you can't actually put objects on it. If you put stuff on it, they fall through it. It's a permeable table. Is that still a table? Okay, maybe not, because it can't function as a table. And they go, aha, but you said it's a structure with 4 legs and a flat top made out of wood, but it has to be permeable. So I didn't include impermeable in my original definition. Sorry, it has to be impermeable. I didn't include impermeable in my original definition. So they got me, so if I give a definition of something like a stance, it may exclude things and include things that I don't really, you know what I mean? Like definitions just kind of.
Oh no, I definitely, yeah, I know what you mean.
So when I talk about stances, I'll talk about a typical stance. A typical stance is going to refer to a psychological state. Now that does not mean that all stances must be psychological states, but it's going to refer to something like an attitude or preference or some specific type of mental state of an agent about how they want things to be. So it'll be like, my stance is that there should be less suffering in the world. I want there to be less suffering in the world. And so those stances can be cashed out in terms of goals if you want, like they want certain sorts of things, but they could also be characterized in sort of conventional normative propositional terms, like I think you shouldn't do this. So stances are like perspectives that agents have about their sort of their like normative position towards things. But if someone comes along and they say, hey, look, here's the Bible. What about the Bible's stance on, abortion, or the Bible's stance on this issue? Can we talk about the Bible's stance? Because the Bible's not a person and it doesn't have mental states. I think yes. And so I don't think stances have to be restricted to like literal living beings. We could talk about the stance. So for me, what's important about a stance is that you judge the content of some normative claim relative to the set of standards contained in some like stance. So a stance, you could say, is any set of normative propositions. That's a good definition. And so it's any set. And then for any claim, you can judge whether it is right or wrong relative to that set of normative propositions. So, and that set could be hypothetical. I could say, imagine an agent had these three stances. You should do this, you shouldn't do that, you should do this. It's not a real agent. So I'm not actually referring to any real mental states. And you could also talk about the stances of like a book or a point of view, or like what's the typical stance of people from you know what I mean? So I think it's like a set of values against which any, claims could be relativized.
Yeah, it kind of reminds me of like the term say. People usually say things, but we use that term, the Bible says.
The Bible says. Yeah.
But yeah, I guess to kind of close out, and this is so when we're having when there's apparent moral disagreement or genuine moral disagreement, especially in the political arena, you see, this is my personal view that a lot of this discourse is either extremely confused, we could talk about disputes that are not confused, like whether there is climate change, or whether we should lower carbon emissions, like that. A lot of that discourse doesn't really revolve around like any kind of moral theory building or metaethical considerations. It just has to do with the descriptive facts. We've discussed this before, but like when it comes to less empirically driven disputes, unlike the case, I think climate change is very much an empirical dispute, more so than people are disagreeing about the values. But I find it very hard to get into, and it doesn't have to be merely political, because the way I see it is that if I can sort of identify that they have very different values than I do, and their values are not motivated by anything that would motivate me, and vice versa, I just don't see. I think that's where I draw the line in terms of any kind of philosophical line of inquiry. And then what tends to happen is that people still insist in taking a philosophical line of a philosophical approach to try to change their mind, and it's usually reduces to like foisting some kind of metaethical theory to get them to change their values, and it's and in my experience, it's somewhat effective. So then we're faced with, okay, so let's say some person, now I'm on YouTube, I'm not on TikTok, so that's nice. So I can imagine myself arguing with the Nazi members of the Nazi Party in the early 30s about what we should do about Jews. I would say, well, look, I care about Jews. I don't think that being Jewish has any kind of significant predictor about how we should treat them or what we should do about them. And it's no different than have a hair color, at least politically speaking. And if they were just to be like, well, I just hate them. I just the term, even the term Jewish triggers me. I just hate the Jews. And there's there's nothing that rationalizes that desire. It's sort of like a base. There's just the way I was raised. I mean, at that point, I don't even know if there's anything to talk about. Now I could invent some kind of moral theory to show that they're out of accord with that moral theory. And they might, be like, oh, well, yeah, if you take a utilitarian approach, if you take this, or if you adopt that moral theory or this moral theory, you're out of line. And sometimes that works, but then I'm sort of, feel like I'm in the, it's, it's just sophistry at that point. If at least if I were to do that, because I don't think that they would be necessarily committed to a utilitarian calculus. Like, I would hope that they became utilitarians, because then they would stop being, they wouldn't go through their like, ethnic cleansing. So like I'd be tempted. I mean, because I would totally use sophistry to like change Nazis' minds about the Jews. Like I would. Like, I mean, if that's what it meant to prevent like millions of deaths, I would absolutely. And so then if in political discourse, if we take an issue that's on the same kind of level, let's just assume that climate change that's some kind of existential threat. Then like participating in that moral discourse, if it requires me, LARPing for moral realism or for some moral theory, I mean, I might just do that. It's kind of a hard thing to navigate for me about what to do. Am I just going to give up like with the Nazi? Like, oh, they just hate Jews. I mean, what is there to dispute philosophically? Like, I mean, I could of course kill them or use, other means of but use other means of changing their mind without philosophical discourse. Yeah.
Hold up. Hey, welcome to the stage, but it looks like you're driving. Is it okay if I bring you back when you're not driving? Sorry,
hey,
Danny.
I'm parking right now.
Oh, okay. Yeah, just I don't want people on here.
No,
driving.
I appreciate it. Definitely. Okay. Yeah, I'm parked at this moment. But continue. I'm enjoying the conversation.
Great. So I brought you up, but I want to finish up with Danny before we talk. All right?
Absolutely.
So cool. What did I say? Everything I said amounts to this. Like, when I find myself in moral disputes and I start to identify, they have a certain set of values that are completely consistent with one another. I'm just very against that system of values. Now, there's nothing philosophically to comment on that. I can't really, I'm not saying that they're being inconsistent within their own system or web of values. So then what am I to do? I mean, it seems like I could get them, look, I'm going to shun you. I won't talk to you. I can, everything from give you the silent treatment to doxing you to reporting you to the police to, I can do those sort of things. But what am I supposed, that's why I see a lot of these debates about abortion, right? And stuff like that. I mean, at some point, I don't really see a debate anymore. There's going to be a point where I don't see the debate anymore. I just see a political rivalry. But people find themselves turning into a philosophical problem. So what are your comments on that?
Yeah, it's strange because, I will sometimes have people say, well, if you're an anti-realist, what would you say to? And then, insert terrible group that commits atrocities or whatever, as if I am somehow barred from saying things that they would say that would work. What do they have access to that I don't? They're going to convince the people that moral realism is true and then get them to think that the facts in question are inconsistent with the moral facts. That's two steps. If the person is in fact motivated by their own goals and values, why can't I just convince them that it's not consistent with their goals and values? Now, what the realist might say is, okay, but what if it is consistent with their goals and values? Okay, so what if I then convince them of realism? And let's say you're an externalist about motivation. Then they could go, okay, those are the moral facts, and I don't care about those. So, unless you're an internalist, I don't see what convincing them of the moral facts is supposed to do. And if you are an internalist, good luck with that. Good luck showing that it's the case that moral facts are intrinsically motivating or necessarily motivating. And even then, the internalist accounts, it's not like they hold if you believe it's true, they could hold this, but it's not plausible. If you believe it's true, you will be compelled to act in accordance with those values. It's more that typically what an internalist will say is it's necessarily but defeasibly motivating. So if you come to believe something is a moral fact, then you'll have some degree of motivation. Okay, well, some degree, how much? That's also an empirical question. But if it's defeasible, so you're going to try to convince them that there's a fact and then hope that that's motivating in a way that maybe is overriding or not. How much is this supposed to compel them? So I don't know what realists think they have access to. But the other thing is that it also, in many cases, seems like an appeal to consequences. If realism isn't true and that makes it unfortunate when you're arguing with people, fine. So here's the point. The realist doesn't really have access to anything I don't have access to. If you could convince me that arguing in favor of moral realism was effective in getting people to not commit atrocities or whatever, I not only would I argue for realism, because I would like, look, what do I think is more important? Preventing people from doing terrible things or promoting moral realism? I think it's preventing people from doing bad things. So I would just straight up just lie. I would shut up. I would say I'm a realist now. I have the intuitions and I'm totally like, if you could show me as a matter of empirical fact, presenting realism as an effective strategy, I'll be a realist, you know?
Right.
But no, show it, prove it. So, you know, I don't actually think they have any access to, like, the only thing they could say is that, well, they would be sincere about those arguments. That's all they could do. So I don't think they have any advantages. But I don't see how this stuff is supposed to be a gotcha, because like, what do they think you're supposed to do? Like, if there's a person that's like, you know, I'm gonna hurt people or whatever, and the person is like being really violent or threatening, like, that you're gonna philosophize with them? Philosophy doesn't hardly ever convince anybody on TikTok or YouTube. Like, what do they think philosophy is capable of? That I just, like, no one is going to do that. They're going to, like, call the police, or if it's self-defense, or intervene if the person's trying to hurt somebody. There are instances where some type of physical altercation is like the only viable means. Like, if aliens show up and they're like, we are going to destroy Earthlings, and we explain to them moral realism, what are they going to go, oh, whoopsie, our bad? No, they can say, we don't care. Then you fight them, and it's like Independence Day or something. I don't know how this is supposed to be some special issue for anti-realism. It's not.
Yeah, I mean, but it also makes it like, it just takes the outlook of a lot of these disputes. Like, I mean, if I were to enter some of these moral disputes, I mean, I wouldn't do it because I'm trying to convince someone of a philosophical position. I would just do it to, like, as a preventative, like, I want to prevent them from having these sort of values. And then, I think that the takeaway from what you're saying, I think, is that what tool do moral realists have that anti-realists don't have? And I think that's something to emphasize.
Yeah, I think they might have a host of rhetorical tools that I would be uncomfortable employing, or that I would be at a disadvantage in employing because I couldn't do so sincerely. That might be what they would have, but it's an empirical question how effective those rhetorical strategies are in the first place. Like, they're like, realists have good rhetorical strategies for making anti-realists look bad. I don't know that they have good rhetorical strategies for changing people's normative moral standards. Maybe they do. But again, I would just say, fine, then you have better rhetorical strategies. It doesn't make your position true.
Right.
You know, kind of like when Christians will say that Christianity makes people happier. That might actually be true, but it doesn't make Christianity true.
Well, that's all I wanted to talk about. I appreciate
what about the opinion stuff?
What
about the opinion stuff? Should we cover that quickly?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, go ahead. And I already said what I wanted to say about that. I wanted to know what you thought. Yeah.
So opinion is one of these words that people use really sloppily in non-technical, like in public discussions and discourse. But a lot of times opinion, it's pretty clear from context what people are trying to get to say with it. So here's one serious problem with the word opinion. Sometimes the word is used to express a person's view about a matter that people would probably roughly regard as some sort of objective fact. Well, what is your opinion? Do you think that scientists have found compelling evidence of life on Mars or something like that? Do you think there's life on Mars? Whatever. Well, there's a fact of the matter about whether there was or is life on Mars, and people have opinions about that. And that seems to be like their personal stance towards the objective fact. But there are also cases where people use opinion talk in a way that's clearly subjective. And so at the very least, opinion talk has both these, like, definitively objective and definitively non-objective uses. And that makes the term virtually useless in a lot of technical contexts. And this is unfortunate. There is an XFI study where they actually ask the participants, do you think that this moral statement is true, false, or just an opinion? And that's a little weird, because something can be true and an opinion, or false and an opinion, depending on how you're using the term opinion. So, like, those aren't mutually exclusive. So yeah, it's just a sloppy word that is used in sloppy ways. And I think people should just generally, you'll almost never see me use that term when talking about anti-realism. I think it just immediately injects confusion into conversation.
Last time I caught myself using the word, what I was trying to convey was that Look, I'm just giving you my view. I'm not saying you should believe it just yet. I haven't given an argument or a reason for you to accept what I'm saying. But I think of the example I'm trying to, like I said, some kind of like the way I see. I don't know. It was something about Christianity. I was like, well, look, the way I see things is that the devil and Jesus have differences in values, and there's not really serious philosophical disagreements about or any meta-ethical disagreements among between Jesus and the devil. They just have different values, and one's gonna like dunk the other one in like a fire. I don't see it as any deeper than that. And I expressed as an opinion just so that the Christian felt comfortable in hearing me out without making them think that like they should believe what I'm saying, because I haven't really provided any kind of reasoning just yet as to why they should hold to my view. So I just didn't, basically to tell them, reveal them, I don't expect you to believe this right now. Like, I'm just sharing my view. So that's the last time I used the term opinion. I realized, oh my gosh, what a not a very clear term, except when used in its context.
Yeah, it's just a term worth avoiding. Okay, so that's everything you wanted to go over? I know we have other people that want to talk, so maybe that's a good way to shake things up and move things around. Do you want to stick around, or are you going to get?
Yeah, I'll stick around for a few minutes, especially since Nathan's here.
Okay.
Hey, I'm just eating some crisps, so that's why I'm on mute, by the way.
What's a crisp? Is that like a cereal?
Oh, like chips or potato chips. I don't know what
It's potato chips, right?
Yeah.
I thought those were chips. Wait, no, fish and chips. Those are fries.
It's French fries. Fries are chips.
Yeah.
Fries are chips, and crisps are chip. Wait. Damn it! You know what I mean.
Oh my goodness! What do you?
Fries are chips, and crisps are chips. Yeah.
What do you have to say for yourself, Nathan?
Well, that's just your opinion. Like.
Okay, so we have a new guest. Why don't you? I think you're up. Why don't you introduce yourself? And we already had a discussion, so we're just moving it over to here.
Okay.
Yeah, no, Lance, I've been following your work, and I think that it's awesome. I mean, I think it would be, maybe that's kind of obtuse as a statement. I've watched a lot of your debates, and I think that you are like the only anti-realist, it's like one of the few that does a really, really good job putting your ideas out there and making them palatable to people like me. So I appreciate that.
Thank you.
So yeah, I was watching your discussion with Richard Brown, and it seemed like you had a very strange idea of what rationality meant. It was something like a behavior that is consistent with desires. Am I wrong?
So there's a few things that I was trying to get out that it's difficult. So we had previously had a discussion in YouTube comments, and it's, your ability to type everything out is very limited there, because it's like, do I want to write an essay or just talk to a person? So I don't know exactly what I said in that video, because it was like a 4-hour video. So I'd have to go back through timestamps to see what I say. And so what I was contrasting my views about rationality with are views of rationality that construe what is or is not, quote unquote, rational to do in ways that are not related to the promotion of a given agent's goals or values. Now, I reject those views of rationality. Now, there are other conceptions that are not necessarily like mutually exclusive, but there are instrumental conceptions of rationality that construe rationality in terms of that set of actions or states, like the steps or actions one could take that would be consistent with achieving one's goals. Like, what would actually achieve your goals? So, a rational person that wants to, take that show Pinky and the Brain. Brain wants to take over the world. So Brain comes up with this plan that's like really effective at taking over the world. Independent, like, even if you think that's a bad goal, certain actions would be conducive towards achieving that goal. So those actions would be instrumentally rational, and then certain actions wouldn't be instrumentally rational. So it's basically saying, look, one way of thinking about what it means for an agent to be acting rationally is if the agent is intentionally taking steps to achieve its goals. And if it were not doing so, it wouldn't be rational. Now, what I want to emphasize about that, though, is that for me, the word rationality, we just need to be cautious about a distinction between words in the English language and like cognate terms in other languages and concepts. Words and concepts are not the same thing. And not that you've suggested otherwise. I'm just saying how I approach this sort of thing. I want to be clear that like I don't take the standard analytic approach that some philosophers might take, where it's like there's this essence of moral goodness, there's this notion of knowledge, and we have to figure out what knowledge really is, and we have to figure out what goodness really is. And I don't think there is this essence of goodness or an essence. Like I think knowledge is like a word in the English language, and I don't think it has to have all these like special parts that when you get if you fix them just right, boom, you figured out what knowledge is. I see rationality the same way. In a certain sense, I don't think there is any such thing as rationality. There's no singular correct account of what rationality is. It's a word. And if we want to figure out what it is we're talking about, we could just specify or clarify what it is that we're describing. And so one of the things I would say is here is a way that one could construe rationality. I'm not saying I'm offering the correct account of rationality. I'm saying, hey, here's one way that I construe and think about rationality, that I would typically say that any given agent is rational insofar as it's acting in a way conducive to its goals, and it's irrational insofar as it's not. And that's very roughly like an instrumental conception.
Right. So acting in a way conducive to its goals just seems like rationality would thereby be an aspect of every free creature. Because if, like we were talking about in the YouTube comments, if I want to quit drinking alcohol and I say, look, I'm going to quit drinking alcohol, but then on my way home, I say, I really need a beer. Right. I have a new goal. And, we're not saying which goal is better. I just have a new goal. My goal is now to drink a beer when I get home. Let's say I get home, I open the fridge and I remember my previous goal. And I think, well, I really did want to quit. Now I'm violating my most recent goal, which is to have a beer when I got home. So how does anyone qualify to be irrational on your view? If everyone is just doing what they want to do in any time.
I think that's a really interesting edge case, but I think one thing it might be useful to clarify before Lance answers that is whether you would agree that there are cases where, for example, plainly you might just want to quit drinking, but then you decide to kick a wall or something instead, right? And that obviously is not conducive to the goal and would be construed as irrational in that view.
Well, I mean, it would be. I mean, that's the thing. It doesn't seem that rationality is difficult there. It seems that goals are, because when I kick the wall, my goal was to kick the wall, right? I wanted to kick the wall.
Well, maybe you didn't though. Can you not set it up so as you sort of didn't want to kick the wall, but that's just what you did? Is that sort of, or is that not making sense?
Yeah,
I don't want to derail Lance's answer.
No. I think that's a great thing to add, because I was telling Lance when we were kind of going back and forth in the YouTube comments, like if you're familiar with like the corpus callosotomy, where they split the brain between hemispheres. Split brain patients actually have this phenomena of, their left hand will start buttoning their shirt and their right hand will be unbuttoning it at the same time. That's presumably not what we're talking about, right? We're saying, if someone has agency, has control of their body, then everything that they're doing is just by default a result of, them completing whatever their nearest goal was. And so behaving in a way conducive to your goals just seems to empty rationality of any meaning. Because I think when I say that a being is rational, what I mean is that they have embarked on like an aspirational project to see the world more clearly. That's what divides the rational person from the irrational person.
Okay, so a few things. And these are all like great points and concerns to raise. One of the things I would say towards the last point is, if rationality is stripped of any sort of non-trivial or substantive content, that's not a problem for me. I don't care if the word is like a useful word. Like I could just say, okay, then I'm using a word in a way that is pretty trivial, not really very important. Okay, like that's, I'm not trying to give a correct account of rationality, because I think that kind of project is misguided in the first place. Like I don't endorse a view of rationality. I'm saying here's a way I think you could use the term. Now, you could say, why would you even propose using the term if you're using it in a way that's so trivial it's not useful and seems to be facing all these problems, when you try to deploy it in some like actual context. And then fair enough, maybe I just, but one of the things I would say about a term like rational would appeal to what Nathan is referring to. I don't think that the useful deployment of terms needs to be able to manage every edge case. So like we could talk about, what we could do is I could say, okay, here's some cases where I could ask myself, would I be disposed to say this person is acting rationally or not? Now, in some cases, I'm making inferences about what their goals are. I'm not telepathic, and I don't have a device that tells me what their goals are. But you could make inferences, and you could look at a person that is, let's say they quit smoking and they start a new exercise routine and they're getting in shape and they are happier. And you talk to them and you say, hey, are you doing the things that you want to do? And they're like, absolutely, I'm way happier. Okay, that person is acting in a way where I would say, yeah, that seems like rational behavior. If you talk to someone and they're trying to do all those things, they're failing at all of them. They keep they're going back to smoking. They signed up for gym membership. They're paying all this money, but they're not going. And then you ask the person and they say, yeah, I'm making a lot of mistakes. I regret what I'm doing. That person themselves might regard their own actions as irrational. Now, what you could then say is like, well, why are you making all these mistakes? Why are you not acting in accordance with your goals? There's a few concerns there, because one thing they could say is, well, I am acting in accordance with my goals. Every time I decide to smoke, I'm acting on my goals. Every time I decide to watch TV instead of going to the gym, I am acting on my goals. So I'm always acting on my goals. So I'm acting in a way conducive to my goals. What are you talking about? So part of the issue here is that goal, I'm using this word that is just ill-suited to handling the way that human psychology works. You mentioned people that have had their corpus callosum severed, and they could be buttoning up the shirt with one hand and unbuttoning it with another. That person is functioning as if they have two different goals, in a sense, because they do. And I think that human brains are already functioning in a way that has a sort of competitive element to it. It's not like we are just a singular agent where the whole brain is centrally unified around a single goal. We have competing drives and impulses. We have compulsions, and we have higher order values that we reflect on. And so the actual structure of human, and I emphasize humans because you could in principle design an artificial intelligence that doesn't work this way. It has one utility function and always acts in accordance with whatever. It has like one streamlined set of goals. But people aren't like that. I can have conflicting goals at the same time. I can both want to do something and not want to do it. And so then if I do it, am I acting in accordance with my goals or not? What I would say about this is that one is that agents can both act in accordance with a goal and not in accordance with a goal in the same at the same time, with respect to the different sort of utility functions, value systems, goal states that they have, because people are weird. Like our brains are these fractionated, partitioned, strange things where we have different drives. The second thing is then what I would say about these sorts of states is that one way I would, if I'm going to sort of elaborate on a notion of rationality, is that I think that we ourselves could, to varying degrees, hierarchically order our values into higher order and lower order values. And we can have stances, attitudes, or views about how we would ideally like ourselves to act. So what a person could say is, look, I know that I want to quit smoking, and I have the goal of quitting smoking, and I have the goal when I do smoke of smoking. But on reflection, all things considered, I want to quit smoking. And so what you could say is that they are acting rationally or irrationally relative to those particular goal states or sets of goals that are derived from, you could say, potentially the same cognitive functions. And so a person can both be,
why, I'm sorry, if you don't mind, why would you suggest that the version of Lance, I don't know if you smoke. Do you smoke?
I do not.
Okay, I don't smoke either. So let's say the version of me that wants to quit smoking, or the version of Lance that wants to quit smoking and says, I am going to quit. Why do we prioritize that version of ourselves over the smoker? Because the one that actually pulls the cigarette out and starts to smoke it, we say, oh, you have violated a promise that you've made to some higher self. These aren't your words, right? But this is kind of the popular conception that there is a higher, because just like rationality is an aspirational project, I think morality or ethics is an aspirational journey, where we're saying, I see a future version of myself that I'm attached to that is better than I am now. And so when I say I want to quit smoking, I'm aspiring to something better, right? And so if we rid ourselves of that, my fear is that there is no, like, who am I breaking the promise to? Is the person who's not smoking breaking a promise to the urge or the desire to smoke? Or is the actual smoking breaking a promise to that aspirational desire to be a non-smoker? right?
Yeah, this seems like a perfectly fine, potentially alternative construal of rationality, and I don't think like one is like more or less correct. Like it's just we get to decide how we want to use these terms and concepts. And what I'm offering is like a proposed labeling system for facts about human psychology, and we can use it or not use it as we see fit. There may be more or less useful ways of describing how people function and how hypothetical possible agents function, and maybe my characterization of rationality wouldn't be useful for that. But I don't know that I need to defend any particular account of rationality in order to make clear that what I'm not accepting is that there's any meaningful sense in which, like what Richard Brown was defending, that notion of rationality is defensible. I don't accept that version. So what I should say just for myself, I spend a lot of time more like saying, here's what I think is wrong and less what I think is right. Part of that is because that's just my disposition and personality. The other part is just that, like, that's just how I am. I think a lot of the projects in philosophy are fundamentally misguided from the outset because philosophers are not clear, or they are clear and they're wrong about what they're doing is misguided. I think like an attempt to give an account of rationality as though there's a correct answer. And again, I'm not saying that's what you're doing, but that's what I think philosophers are doing, is just misguided from the outset. There's no such thing as a correct account of rationality. There are more or less useful ways of carving up the descriptive space of facts about what the world is like, and it's up to us to carve them up the way that we want. Now, that's not to say it's completely arbitrary. There are going to be, to borrow a term from Dan Dennett, real patterns in what the world looks like. And that's the sort of stuff that we get out of the sciences, but it's also the stuff that we get out of our normative discourse. Normative discourse for me is best seen as a constructive enterprise that incorporates a large part of conceptual engineering. So our task there is to, when it comes to like what we should do or what we want to do, we should focus more on, when it comes to these concepts, devising system structures and concepts that we can employ in a way that will achieve our goals, rather than try to figure out what's true. So if your proposed account of rationality were like a useful conception, I would have no problem endorsing it.
And now, you don't think that rationality thought of as an aspirational project which has as a goal seeing the world more clearly, you don't think that that's a useful conception of rationality?
Well, so I would be really concerned with when you say that last part. What was that about? Something about the world?
Seeing the world more clearly.
Yeah, seeing the world more clearly.
I'm not super clear, I guess, ironically, on what exactly that means. But
Precisely.
One thing I would have a concern with is if someone said, hey, it's rational, for instance, to have more like, quote unquote, true beliefs, or to have a more accurate model of what the world is like. Because what if a person doesn't have the goal
do you think
accurate
true beliefs is something we really care about, though?
I don't know. I mean, it really depends on what we mean by true. I think people are motivated by their goals and values, and I don't think having an accurate model of what the world is like is the only or primary thing that people care about. But a lot of philosophers seem to think that our epistemic conduct should be centered around like acquiring true beliefs to the exclusion of achieving our goals, holding all else constant. And I just don't think that I don't think that there are irreducibly normative facts about what our epistemic practices should be like. So I would be really uncomfortable with a notion of rationality that says that I'm being irrational in some sort of objectionable way if I'm acting in a way that is conducive to my goals, and I'm like I am succeeding at my goals, but I end up holding a less accurate model of reality. I would rather achieve my goals.
Well, I mean, isn't this conversation an attempt to find overlap with respect to the way we see the world? I mean, I think if I were centrally focused on my own goals, I guess I could just have the goal of having a fun semantic banter, with a really smart philosopher that I think is insightful. But at the same time, I think that the reason that we debate and the reason we argue, especially if an argument is disagreeable, if you've seen two people in a shouting match, it's like, what are you two warring perspectives shouting at each other over, right? The reason they're shouting at each other is because they're saying there is one world, and I think I see it clearly, and I think that you're missing out on something which I think is obvious, right? So in almost everything we do with respect to our relationships to one another, it seems like we just have this underlying project of seeing the world more clearly.
I mean, I don't know what exactly response to go with.
I mean, does it seem like what I said was wrong, or am I off?
Well, I mean, are you asking about my goals in a conversation?
Well, no, I'm just saying. Well, yeah, sure. Like, with this type of conversation, right? It seems like you're willing to glean insight from me. You're listening.
Mm-hmm.
You know, you might not be expecting to have your fundamental ideas changed, right? But you're at least listening in a humble way, thinking that this guy might actually have something which changes my mind. And what that means is a part of this conversation is like, maybe I can see the world more clearly as a result of my interlocutor. At least the best philosophers are that way.
When you put it in those terms, that sounds totally fine to me. But, you know, I'm always wary of people. So we all have our own personal way of framing things when we're talking about philosophical issues. Now, if I'm reading an article or a paper or something like that, a person can lay out, like when they say, see the world more clearly, they could say, here's precisely what I mean by that. But I don't know precisely what you mean by that. And a lot, like you're using like a turn of phrase where I have to make an inference about what you mean by that. And it sounds totally fine to me. It sounds benign. Like, yeah, sure. I'm trying to see the world more clearly. But I have learned through bitter experience, and not from talking to you, but from talking to a lot of philosophers and a lot of people in life. You know, I have thousands of conversations. What like analytic philosophers and people in the sort of orbit or read their books and are learn to think like they do, what they end up doing is when you take a phrase like that, see the world more clearly, and you say, yeah, I'm trying to do that. What they'll do is they'll then smuggle in all the metaphysical mumbo jumbo and other sorts of like positions that they have in the back door, because what they really mean is by that phrase is X, Y, and Z that I didn't know that's what they meant and I don't endorse. And then when I agree, then they go, aha, so you're committed to this and you're committed to that. So analytic philosophers are really, I think, especially guilty of playing this semantic Trojan horse game where they get you to accept some proposition and then trot out all their nonsense afterwards. And so I have to be really careful with endorsing a phrase or not.
Sure.
Not because I think you're trying to do that. It's because what we really need to do in conversations is when people use turns of phrase is we need to stop and say, okay, well, what do you mean by that? And often why that's important is because I have a whole set of background beliefs and views and perspectives and ways of framing things that feed into and are presupposed in my own use of that turn of phrase. Like if I said, see the world more clearly, I actually would I'm guessing I might actually mean something different from that than you. And so if I say yes to a sentence, but then in my mind, that sentence means one thing, and in your mind, that sentence means something else, we're not really agreeing. We're actually just, it superficially looks like we're agreeing because we're both affirming a sentence, but we actually take the sentence to mean something in accord with your presuppositions in your case and mine in my case, without that being clear. So for a lot of these discussions to be productive, I think we need to just keep peeling back the layers to get to our more foundational approach to these sorts of things. And as long as we're not entering with a intersubjective awareness of a shared meta-philosophy or methods for addressing questions, we really just don't know what our presuppositions are, like yours or mine.
Yeah, absolutely. And I don't want to take up too much time on the stage. I wanted to in your last conversation, which was a really good one, you said realists sometimes make anti-realists look bad, and it doesn't mean that realism is true, which is absolutely that's a true statement. But I guess what I'm wondering is, where does intuition play a role? Being that no one really cares about the truth. Like if we really, really cared about the truth, we would know how many pages there are in our favorite book, or how many bristles there are on our toothbrush, or how many objects are in our medicine cabinet. We care about relevant truths. We care about the truths that matter to me, right? We don't care about truth in general. So when it comes to that intuitive part, that part of me that says, look, even after all of the arguments are gone, even after Lance Bush has destroyed all of the, arguments for realism, there's just something that feels off about it, right? Like, you don't have to be smarter than Dr. William Lane Craig to say, you know what, even though I can't defeat his positions, something just kind of seems off. It just doesn't feel right. How much weight do you give to that, or is that not philosophically interesting?
Before you respond, Lance, I do have to take my leave. Thanks for having me on, and congratulations on your 1,000 subscribers.
Yeah, good evening, Dean.
Thank you.
I'll see y'all later.
Yeah, see you later, Danny. Thanks for being here. So we do have a few other people up here. Give me one moment, and so just a couple things. I want to get everybody involved in the conversation that is up here, but I also want to keep things I'm letting things get a little chaotic and out of hand. So give me one moment. Hey, so we'll probably keep the conversation limited to topics that I'm comfortable discussing. So Wesley, it looks like you want to talk about some stuff that I don't think I'm up for talking about today. So just message me, and I'll see if there's a time that maybe we could have a conversation. But I don't think that the particular topics that's something I want to talk about, if that's okay.
That's totally fine.
Oh, I'm not talking about what you said.
Oh, I thought. Okay, sorry.
Oh, sorry. I was directing that at Wesley. Okay, so we will talk another time. Just okay. All right. So you were asking about intuitions. Can you maybe? Sorry, there was a little bit of distraction with Danny leaving and everything there.
No worries.
Re-articulate the sort of like, I don't know, the too long version of that. Sorry about that.
Yeah, no worries. And I wanted to maybe put it to you, or maybe anybody else, like, you've probably, in your time, maybe when you were younger in philosophy, just heard an argument maybe for the existence of God or for something that you don't think is true, and maybe the person was just better at arguing than you, but you had this intuitive feeling that it's like, something's off about that, even though I can't word it, even though so how much weight do you give to that when it comes to people who are moral realists, who just say, you know what, Lance makes some really smart points and he makes me think, but at the end of the day, it just doesn't seem right.
Okay, so I'll get to that, but the rest of you that are here, you'll be jumping in the conversation soon, if you want to, unless you just want to hang out. That's cool. So it's really this is a lame answer, but it's really context dependent how I judge these sorts of things. I'll give some examples. When people give testimony of religious or supernatural or paranormal events, no matter how much I think that the person is being sincere. I don't think that the person was like on drugs or hallucinating. I'm just mega skeptical. And I can't see a reasonable context, given everything else I believe and know about what the world is like, where I would find those reports compelling. So people's testimony just doesn't seem to typically have the sort of overriding force to compel me to change my beliefs, given the content of the testimony. Like, I just can't imagine that there's enough cases of people reporting religious experiences where it would be likely to change my mind. Now, there are factors that would shift that. It would depend on like how many people, who these people are, how often this happens, but also my background beliefs. If I start seeing anomalies and inconsistencies with my existing beliefs, that's going to bump up my credence in taking the testimony seriously. But that's because my own beliefs, and I think this is generally true of other people's beliefs, operate holistically. And, I operate in some ways as a sort of very crude and imperfect Bayesian, where when you're presenting me with a given claim, I come at it with a given prior, like I already have my confidence is this high. And even if you have if you're Bayesian, if you have a really strong prior that something isn't true, even if someone presents you what you genuinely regard as good evidence, and it has exactly the evidential impact it sort of ought to have, given like if you plug it in to Bayes' theorem, you're still not going to change your mind. So that is how I think a lot of my reactions to a lot of things that I don't agree with feel. They feel like yeah, I don't have a compelling response. I don't have much of a way of countering this, but given all the rest of my background beliefs, I don't buy it. And that would be true, especially of cases like testimony. So, if someone says they saw Bigfoot in the woods, I don't have how can I refute that? Maybe they did, but it's not going to move me. So that is the first thing I would say is that, you could think of this. I don't know if I said this somewhere already, but you can kind of do this like if you're presented with a proposed belief, you can do this sort of like ripple test. And the ripple test is how much, like if this was true, like conditional on the statement being true, how much would its truth ripple across the rest of your belief network in a way that's super disruptive? How many other beliefs would you have to change in order for this belief to be true? And if the answer is a whole hell of a lot of them, then you're much less likely to integrate it into that structure. So what's more likely that, if let's say I currently have 1 million beliefs, what's more likely? 500,000 of my beliefs are false and this thing is true, or that all 500,000 are true and this thing is false? And if those are my options, it's probably that thing is false because I already have good reason for the background beliefs. But as far as intuitions go, specifically in the case of realists, and I'll wrap up here and then we'll see if other people want to jump in, unless I don't know. We'll just see where this goes.
Yeah.
But I get increasingly anxious when I bring people up and they haven't had a chance to talk yet. And we can always talk more. So in the specific case of realists, I find myself, and this is just being honest, completely unmoved by them reporting realist intuitions. I don't feel it's moving my dial anywhere. I could say as much as I like I could try to be as epistemically virtuous as I want. And I could say, hey, technically speaking, on Bayesian grounds, anyone that provides testimony of anything is some minimal degree of evidence in favor of it. And I do think that, intellectually speaking, that's true. Like the fact that some people believe in God, that's some evidence that God exists. And it's easy to say why. In a world in which there's no Bigfoot, it's less likely that people report seeing Bigfoot in the woods than a world in which there is. So if I'm in a world in which people do report seeing Bigfoot, that is more consistent, all else being equal, with there being a Bigfoot than a world in which they don't report it. So it's going to cause me to update a little bit, but just not that much, because I have all these background reasons for thinking they probably didn't see Bigfoot.
Right.
And so the fact that there's a world in which people do say God exists that's some little bit of, it's a tiny bit of evidence in favor of God's existence. So intellectually speaking, the fact that there are lots of realists, I take to be some evidence of realism. But when I think about, there's a few things for me that I think really push my skepticism to much greater levels than I think a lot of anti-realists, including ones working within academic philosophy. I haven't seen any in academic philosophy that seem as confident about anti-realism as me. I don't know. I don't have a confidence meter, and I haven't asked them all. But one is that I don't actually think that there are that many moral realists, at least not non-naturalist realists. So a lot of philosophers operate under the presumption that there's most people are intuitive or implicit realists, and I don't think that that's true. I think moral realism is largely confined to academic philosophers and people that have read their work. So there's a variety, and I could list out a bunch of other considerations about why I think that the kinds of intuitions that philosophers report are they're a mistake being made that isn't that independent of one another. So, standard example you might give, let's say you showed up to a scene, there's a murder scene and you're a detective and you're trying to figure out what happened here, who committed the murder. And there's 10 different witnesses and they're all totally different and none of them have talked to each other or met each other. And you set them all aside and you interview them one by one, and they're not in the same waiting room together. They don't talk to each other. You get a statement from all 10 and they all tell you the same story. It's pretty good evidence of whatever it is they're reporting. So 10, in other words, genuinely independent witnesses giving the same account is good evidence that the account is true, all else being equal. But let's say you showed up to the murder scene and there's 10 people and they're all wearing the same weird outfit. So they're all wearing a weird purple hat and white robes. They look like they're part of a weird cult or something. And they're all standing together and they're all talking. And then you ask them what happened and they all tell you the same story. Are you going to put the same amount of stock in that account? What do you think? You would say, no,
not at all. No,
maybe they look weird. So the way that they're dressed, maybe it's a cult that does human sacrifice. You don't know. They all talk to each other. They're not independent of one another. If they're all dressed the same way, they probably know each other and they probably have similar beliefs. And there's all sorts of reasons why it's immediately obvious that they're not independent judges. They have influenced one another. So when I look at academic philosophers, the question is, how representative are the moral realists, non-naturalist realists in particular, because I don't really care about naturalist realism. with, you know, how independent are they as judges about whether realism is true, and how independent are they as people given the psychological influences and history and enculturation from one another, such that they are, you could say, they're sort of independent judges? I think the answer is not very much. I mean, so if we look at the survey results of the 2020 Phil Paper survey, it's mostly people from the United States, UK, Canada. It's like mostly people from the Anglophone world that grew up in the Anglophone world. These are all people from similar cultural backgrounds that then study the same corpus of writings, which is mostly people from the same background. Like they read mostly work in English by people where they were English native speakers. And then there's all these other demographic similarities. So you're talking about a group that it's people that are disproportionately affluent, people that have disproportionately received particular types of education, people that have disproportionately been grown up in certain kinds of cultures. Then you look at the psychological data and you see that the particular populations they come from are one of the least psychologically representative of people around the world. So this is a group that is a narrow, it's a subset of 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 a subset. And then you're looking at just those people's judgments of, like, the Phil Paper survey. It's 228 people specialized in metaethics when they responded to that survey out of the 1,785. I think it's like 13% of them or something.
Wow.
228 people. So I'm going to trust the judgments of 228 people.
For sure.
Now that might generalize to analytic philosophers, and then we can ask how many of those are. There's a few tens of thousands. Okay, fine. And 1785, that's actually a pretty good sample size. So it's probably representative of analytic philosophers, but is it representative of people? No. So, you know, so there's all these background stuff that I've read, work from Stephen Stitch, Edward Maschery, other people that, you know, and Maschery and Mallon have this great paper, Evolution of Morality, where they argue that the claim that morality evolved is actually ambiguous. And when you disambiguate it, it's actually really complicated. So I'll just sum everything up. I think that there are good empirical reasons, some of them more well-established and others less well-established, for being highly suspicious of what academic philosophers say. And it follows the sort of garbage in, garbage out principle. Those philosophers are using the same methods, and they come from, basically, they're not independent thinkers. And so if there's some shared flaw in the way that they're all thinking, that would account for why they all have similar views. And so my skepticism isn't doubting thousands of people that all independently study the topic. It's doubting a group of people that have all studied the topic in the same way, reading the same stuff, and that all interact with each other. It's people with purple hats on. And I don't trust a group of people with purple hats on as much.
Fair enough.
Sorry, that was a very comprehensive response. So
no, I appreciate that.
All right. So do you have other, should we let other people jump in? I don't know how.
Yeah, definitely bring other people in.
Okay.
Well, regarding the like realist and like anti-realist distinction, I think that like when you're introducing like new people to the metaethics, or like even the quote unquote like intermediate philosophers, which are like tipping their toes into like beginning of the metaethics, I think that like this like distinction at the very beginning of like, here's like anti-realism and here's like realism, like anti-realism just like loses from the get-go, because like it sounds more appealing to say that you're a realist, and then like people hear this like name of, oh whoa, I'm a realist, and that's why they've kind of like from the very beginning they're more appealed to this stance, even though the stance itself could be like very like confused, unclear, ambiguous, and so on. So that's also like a problem that I've noticed, is just like the problem of terminology, you know.
Yeah, this is something I've written a blog about, how like we should change the name of moral realism and anti-realism. And I actually have an upcoming blog post where I'm going to be talking about this. I'll be mentioning this sort of thing. I don't like the framing of realism and anti-realism, in part because some people will say, oh, if you're a moral anti-realist, that means you think that morality isn't real. And that's weird. I don't think morality is not real. And what's really strange about that is that's so unclear, and yet academic philosophers will use that phrase. I've had philosophers tell me, yeah, you're an anti-realist, you think morality is not real. Oh no, we lost Nathan. Sorry, Nathan, jump back in. We got to talk some more. That's too bad. Maybe it was a technical issue, but I'd love to talk some more, Nathan.
Maybe he just closed the window, you know, accidentally.
Yeah, maybe. I don't know. Yeah, I was just in Nathan's stream yesterday talking about panpsychism, so maybe I should do a video talking about that. Anyway, so when you like if you say it's not real, what is it that you're saying isn't real? If you mean that you don't think objective moral facts are real, fine. Yeah, I don't think those are real, but why not say that? Why frame it as though morality just is objective morality? That's a little presumptuous, but also it can give the mistaken impression that you're denying a bunch of like really mundane things that clearly are real. Like people make moral judgments. We have moral values and institutions. Exactly. There's moral psychology. Like, am I saying it? I think it could give the impression, like, imagine you ran into somebody and they said, yeah, I don't think morality is even real. I think if you ask people, is that person as trustworthy as a person that thinks morality is real? They'd say no. Or are they as likely to be a good person? Are they as likely to be, if you said, who do you think donates more to charity? A person that thinks morality is real or someone that doesn't? People are going to say somebody that does. So that phrase, morality isn't real, I think carries connotations or implications about the person's disposition, attitudes, and behavior precisely. That would not be carried by the person saying, I don't think moral propositions refer to or attempt to describe stance-independent moral facts. Does that make you an evil person? No, but morality isn't real. You sure sound a little suspicious. So, yeah, I think that's a really common problem. The thing is, I actually suspect this kind of playing with framing and words, like I focus on metaethics. I think it's everywhere. I think it's everywhere in academic philosophy. Philosophers are so quick to say, if you hold this skeptical view, you can't say this thing. Like, if you're a global skeptic, then you can't say the world is real. And it's a lot of philosophers playing around with words where, okay, actually unpack what, like, okay, people will say relativists. If you're a relativist, then you have to think that if someone thinks it's okay to do bad things, it's okay for them to do bad things. Like, it's good for them to do it. Often, maybe, have you seen my stuff on like agent and appraiser relativism?
Yeah, I was just.
Yeah, so you're already familiar with that.
Yeah.
But what they'll try to do is imply that you yourself approve of the person's actions. You think it's good for the person. Then that might be true of certain types of agent relativism, but it's not true of appraiser relativism. And yet, again, you will see professional philosophers do this. They'll frame things in terms of morality isn't real. They'll frame things in terms of, if you're an anti-realist or you're a relativist, you think terrible actions are good. And if you get them to unpack exactly what your commitments actually are, if you're, say, an appraiser relativist, when an appraiser relativist says, if a person thinks it's okay to hurt people, then it is, quote unquote, okay to hurt people. What that means is it is consistent with the goals of a person that wants to hurt people. It ends up being a tautology, and that tautology would be true. Oh, wow, everyone left. Whatever.
Yeah, there's just the two of us.
Yep. So even if, sorry, where was that?
Yeah, we're going.
I got so distracted by that. Oh,
yeah, we're going appraiser and agent relativism. Yeah.
Hey, welcome back. So I totally lost my train of thought. Okay, I'll just start over. Okay, so if you're an appraiser relativist and someone said, like, the sentence, oh, right, it was the sentence. The sentence, like, Alex thinks it's okay to hurt people. And so if Alex then says, it's okay for me to hurt people, the appraiser relativist would say, that's true. So it is okay for, like, the Alex's statement that it's okay to hurt people is true. Now, what does that mean on the appraiser relativist account? It means it is consistent with Alex's goals to hurt people because Alex wants to hurt people. It has nothing to do with your own endorsement of it. It's not you evaluating that as good or bad from your own point of view. It's not you saying that you want them to do it. It has nothing to do with that. It's a way of saying, look, if the semantics of ordinary language is such that when people make moral claims, they're talking about their own values, they're indexed to the person's standards. Okay, well, on the appraiser relativist view, it's just that that's just how the language works, and that's what people mean when they make the claims. It has nothing to do with their own attitudes or values. So, but what realists will do is they'll try to leverage the fact that you're an anti-realist and you're an appraiser relativist, so you have to agree that when Sam says it's okay for them to hurt people, it's true. As if you have to be okay with them hurting people, even if you're not committed to that. And I'm not saying like as a matter of empirical fact, I'm saying like technically that is not an entailment of appraiser relativism, that you have to be okay with that. Because you could say, when they say the sentence, it's okay for them to hurt people, it is true because you just translate the sentence. The person is saying it's consistent with my values to hurt people. Okay, what is it? That has no implications for what I do. So I don't understand why realists play this game, this rhetorical game, when you unpack it, it's so clearly bullshit. I don't know why they do it. And I don't know why their colleagues don't point it out. I don't know of any academic paper that has pointed out this rhetorical trick, this trick of equivocating on the meaning of the sentence and saying, hey, you're committed to this sentence being true, where if you understand what it is that they're saying is true in the technical sense, it's completely benign. It's a tautology, right? But they're implying some colloquial usage that you're committed to that isn't the technical meaning. They equivocate or vacillate between the technical meaning of the sentence and some colloquial meaning of the sentence that carries negative connotations to imply that if you accept the technical conception, you're committed to the colloquial conception. And it's a verbal trick. It's obvious.
Do you think that was the disconnect between you and Dr. Richard Brown?
I don't think so. No, I don't know what I don't know.
Okay, maybe that was different.
No,
because I know he was trying to use Kantian deontology to show you that your desires to, because I think the way you put it was, I want to see my own goals accomplished and I don't care about the goals of someone else. I think he was trying to use Kantian deontology to show that you have at least an imperfect duty to value someone else's values. And you were saying, no, I don't have to, value someone else's values. I could have my values. You brought up a really good analogy, like with a UFC fighter. You said, if I'm a UFC fighter and I want to embarrass my opponent, that doesn't mean that I want to be embarrassed. I don't have to endorse, being embarrassed in general to want to embarrass someone and then want to not be embarrassed, or want to win the fight and not want to lose the fight. But I think that what he was gearing towards is that the actual end of each action should be universalizable. And that was, Kant's way of saying, like, he thought, for instance, you have a perfect duty not to lie, because by lying, you're saying a lie ought to be done. And that's a world that would be impossible to live in, a world where everyone lies. A lie would be impossible to accomplish.
Yeah, but that's like a normative system claim, and that's not really a mathematical claim. To discuss like the mathematics of Kantian deontology, we have to go like a step deeper,
Yeah. So
yeah.
My issue with that is that it looks like he was saying that I get the impression, and maybe this is not Brown, but maybe this is people that endorse Kantian style views. It's as if, okay, if I value something, I value happiness. Well, I value happiness because happiness is valuable. And so therefore, given that happiness is valuable, that's why I value it. It's like it has its own value. And so other people value happiness. And so I have to somehow accord respect to or weight to the fact that they value it too, because they're valuing something that is itself valuable. And so I'm going for something valuable. They're going for something valuable. There's no difference. And so,
but happiness, but it's impossible to value happiness. Happiness has value intrinsically. So we could just pick
something else. We could just pick something else.
Well, I mean, but isn't that interesting? Like with respect to the conversation itself, that there are things which are intrinsically valuable that we don't add valuable.
I would just say like they're instrumentally valuable, because like intrinsic value to me is kind of incomprehensible. I don't know what it really means.
So, I mean, happiness is not it can be instrumentally valuable, and like if I want to do something nice for my wife, or if I want to, then I could use that happiness instrumentally to do other good things. But happiness has value of its own. When you're happy, that's the value itself. It's
yes.
Right?
No, I agree with you. So, but we need to make clear a distinction here. There's a distinction between what you could say is a terminal or a non-instrumental value, something that is valued for its own sake. That concept is, and that's what I think happiness is. It can be valued instrumentally, but I also value happiness for its own sake. Like I just want the happiness. I don't want it for something else. I just want the happiness itself. So in that sense, yeah, it's. But I wouldn't use the term intrinsically, because that's ambiguous between that meaning of it, which is terminal or non-instrumental value, and another meaning, which is that it itself has the property of valuableness, such that it's not that I value it. It's that it has the quality of being valuable. And I don't think anything has the quality of being valuable in and of itself. I think that that is sort of project. So I see valuing more as something that like beings do. I value things, but I don't think that the things thereby have value. It's the same way that like, if I'm eating food, like I think some food is tasty, but I don't think the food has the property of tastiness. When I eat the food, it's interacting with my physiology, and then it's causing psychological states in me. So there's a dynamic relation between me and my interaction with the food. The food doesn't have like tastiness particles. It doesn't have tastiness as a property. No food is intrinsically tasty. And I see happiness the same way. Happiness, I think, is better understood as describing certain types of psychological states, and we might construe it as states that we like or we desire or that we want. And then it can make it trivially the case that those states are exactly the sorts of things that, like, you could say by definition we want. Or
is it possible to not desire happiness?
I don't know.
Yeah,
I think so.
It's
like,
possible
yeah.
to desire not to be happy. Because
I think so.
there's a part of me that wants to say that like suffering is like banned from preference. Like one cannot prefer to suffer because
Why?
suffering by definition
Why so?
is because of the definition of suffering, which is
Well, what
like
if I give a different definition, you know? Such that
then
it
we're
would-
just kind of
so-
playing a
so-
semantic game.
Yeah, but like it starts from the definition, and then we kind of build our scheme way up, you know?
Sure, but I mean, I think
That's
if
always
we
the
use it, instead of making up a new definition, we can just take what suffering means colloquially.
Okay, so what
And
does it mean
so-
colloquially? Maybe we just need to clarify the terms that we're using.
A state that someone wants to escape from, all right? Like suffering is just a state that someone doesn't want to be in, right? It's
Well,
and-
I would add like usually or like generally, you know, because like you don't like to claim that you actually need to examine every like human being, at least like currently that exists, and like personally you give them the questionnaire of like whether do you think like this definition of like suffering is like okay for you.
I don't think that that's necessary. I can know what happiness is without studying every human being and how they respond. I mean, it's like
Yeah, generally yes, but like that doesn't
Yeah, and
exclude every case, you know, possible.
yeah. I mean, I don't mind that, right? If I'm using a term, I don't need to have it universalized in that way.
Well,
I mean,
I
or
can agree with that. Yeah, of course.
yeah, for sure. And so I don't know. I guess I'm struggling with the idea that because value, I would definitely agree, is a transjective property that it doesn't intrinsically belong to a subject or an object. Value is a particular relationship between an object and a subject.
Yeah, I would say that like for something to have value, there needs to be a valuer such that it kind of inscribes value into like certain things, you know. That's how I would like to put it. So it's not like only an object or only a subject. It's like an like subject / objective kind of interaction relation. So yeah, I agree with that wholly.
Right. And I don't think that valuing is all that arbitrary. People tend to value the same thing. We tend to value connection, love, kindness, and it's so predictable that it tends to be more or less worldview transcendent. Our valuing of these things,
Yeah,
right?
that's because we belong to the same species. You know, we have like a very like similar evolutionary history. We have like some cultural, let's say, connections that let our values kind of relate to a certain extent. You know, those all factors contribute to like our values be like largely very kind of intersecting. You know.
Right. What's your understanding of constructivism as a moral philosophy?
Well, I kind of endorse like a version of constructivism, kind of an evolutionary.
So do I.
Evolutionary constructivism. I don't like exactly know whether there's like such a term in academic discussion, but like I like just kind of put this label on my my version of how I would suggest, like how we came up with this like morality discourse. And like basically, I think that the thesis of evolutionary constructivism would be we construct moral in like generally we construct our like ethical or moral systems in such a way that it would promote our cooperation, the survival of our species, the proper functioning of the institutes, the like general like good flow of our like everyday activities, let's say, and all this kind of stuff.
If I were to say God exists, God is that which is fundamental. God is not a moral agent, but God is conscious, right? So God is this
Okay.
non-moral, conscious, omniscient, omnipotent creator of the universe, or that out of which the universe emerges. And you and I and Lance create these moral categories, not out of nowhere and not for no reason, but because we are fundamentally a united thing. We are fundamentally this one being, having a dissociated experience, right? And this dissociated experience is what the Hindus would call Maya. It's the illusion of separateness. So we're experiencing this illusion of separateness, and our moralizing, our saying that is wrong and that is right, is basically our awareness that um, that separation or dissociation is an illusion and that association is the truth. So whenever we see associative behaviors like love, charity, kindness, we say those are good because they remind us of the association, which is fundamental. And whenever we say, stealing is wrong, murder is bad, rape is wrong, pillaging is bad, we are merely shaking our fist at the illusion of separateness, which is being aggrandized by those behaviors. Would that be a version of constructivism?
Yeah, it's kind of a mystical slash like Hinduistic version of constructivism. But like I see like where you're getting it, because like we're like kind of coming from the same direction. It's just I'm using the evolutionary perspective because I think it's like more explanatorily powerful. It doesn't require like as many ontological commitments. It has like generally better predictions. We know the modal like better. That's why from the pragmatic sense of point of view. Although I'm not like completely an atheist, I'm kind of in between being a pagan and like an atheist, So that's how I am. Yeah, but I just use it like the evolutionary constructivist model instead of this like mystical slash Hinduistic view. Let's just say it, just because it has like more explanatory value generally. That's why.
I see. Yeah, and I mean, I really don't. I've struggled, like, because I know that there are mystics. I mean, I might consider myself a mystic, but I don't think that there's much mystery in it. Like, I consider myself a skeptic, but I realize like consciousness is the only thing that we know absolutely for sure. It's the only thing that can't be doubted, and it's the only thing that can't be an illusion, because consciousness is the antecedent for doubt and for illusion.
Cartesian argument, so like cogito ergo sum. So yeah, that's a classical argument, but I do not agree with that, because like I'm generally like a qualia like eliminativist slash like quietist. Let's just say. Yeah, by the way, Lance, what is your stance on qualia? Like,
on consciousness?
Yeah, on consciousness and qualia.
Yeah, so I endorse and also welcome Piper. I endorse a view called Qualia quietism, and it's a view put forward by Pete Mandic in his 2016 paper. That's like right in the title. It's like meta-illusionism, Qualia quietism. Basically, I think a lot of the terms and concepts that philosophers use when they discuss consciousness are not meaningful, but I also deny that these concepts are shared by ordinary people. That's what my upcoming blog series is about. I think that basically philosophers, and this generalizes, it's not just metaethics. So moving into consciousness, I think the same about free will. I think philosophers use technical versions of stuff that might have some type of folk analog, but in ways that are not meaningful because of the distorted and flawed methods that analytic philosophers use. So basically, I think that they're talking of qualia and what it's like and that sort of stuff. is just a bunch of nonsense. I don't think it's meaningful. But that doesn't mean that I think consciousness doesn't exist. I think there's like clearly people have subjective experiences. And clearly there's something rich and interesting and fascinating and really difficult to study there. I just don't think that the approach that philosophers take, which I think is basically to throw a bunch of words around and think that they're getting something done, is very effective. And I favor a more pragmatic and empiricist approach than a lot of what I'm seeing coming out of philosophers.
Yeah, well, the thing that I don't really get on board with the most of like analytic philosophy in past like 4 or 5 decades regarding consciousness is like this like hard problem of consciousness, you know, because like I can understand, I can like clearly see like the plausible answers for the quote unquote like simple or like weak problem of consciousness, or like easy as they put it, but like this like notion of strong, how did they exactly call it, like a strong problem of consciousness, or like I forgot the
Well, it's
term.
the hard problem.
The hard problem.
Yeah, the hard problem.
And there's like the easy problem, and then other people have
Yeah.
tried to be cute and pose like the
and
what is it, the
regarding,
real
like,
hard
that-
problem? There's a couple phrases.
Yeah,
There's
so
also
like
the
regarding
meta
the
problem.
hard problem of consciousness, I basically
Oh, right, the meta problem.
an eliminativist, you know, or like an alternative version of eliminativist, because I'm not like exactly on board with the Churchill's version of eliminativist, if that makes sense, you know. And I kind of endorse like Quietism as well, because it's aligning with my like generally empiricist and like pragmatic, like general epistemic sense, I would say.
Yeah, so I'm not an eliminativist. Eliminativism, I think, one of the things that I'm cautious about doing is ceding the linguistic ground to people that endorse fundamentally different conceptions of what the world is like than I am. And this is why I don't endorse something like, I mean, among other reasons, why I don't endorse error theory. So moral error theory. So error theory is this view that moral claims purport to describe an objective, or you could say stance-independent moral reality, but they systematically fail to do so. Now, I reject the first claim. I think that there's serious problems with that. But another problem I have with error theory is that when the error theorists themselves, it's like, look, this is just what moral language is. It's this objectivist language. And if you're committed to that, that's how the language is, then, and you think it's all false, you can't like use it. Like you would have to be a fictionalist. So you'd have to say, look, it's not technically true, but I'm going to pretend it's true. So the error theorist gets themselves in all these verbal binds. They sort of, are tying their own hands behind their back because they're adopting an approach towards language where they are granting that, well, if non-philosophers use the language this way, that's just what the words mean. And too bad for me, I don't get to use the words. Well, who said non-philosophers get to own the language? But, when you have this view that sentences have intrinsic meanings or correct meanings, it's not that the non-philosophers own the language. It's that the nobody owns the language. The language means what it means. And too bad if it turns out to be false. So they're like externalizing the meaning of sentences, like murder is wrong. And then as an error theorist, like they can't agree with that. They can't say, yeah, it's true that murder is wrong. So I'm a moral anti-realist. I don't think there stands independent moral facts. I think murder is wrong. I don't think the way other people use words, they don't have a monopoly on the language. They don't own the language. I'll use whatever damn words I want to. So I have no problem saying that. And I'm not being revisionary because I don't grant that I'm revising your language. I get to use words however I damn well please. And so I already think people do this. And so I just think that philosophers, a lot of them have gotten stuck with this really goofy notion of the way that language works. And it's holding back the entire field, is goofy notions of language. Piper, did you have something to say? Did you want to jump in here?
So, I mean, I didn't have anything immediately in mind.
That's totally okay. I just wanted to give you a chance to speak.
Yeah, thanks. I appreciate it. I'll jump in when I have something to say.
So it's been almost 2 hours. So let me just, for people that have joined the chat since then. So I've been away. So I don't even know if everybody already knows what I do and who I am and all that stuff. So actually, I'll just introduce myself in the middle of the stream. Why not? So I'm Lance Bush. I recently finished my PhD in psychology back last year. I work in meta-ethics and I specialize in the psychology of meta-ethics. And mostly on my channel, I complain about moral realism and about academic philosophy. I do complain about other stuff. Like here's a potential thing. Maybe none of you would be interested in it. I actually think that the current system of basically mandatory pre-publication peer review, like this system where you don't really get to have your papers be published unless you submit it to an academic journal and then editor takes it and they hand it off to reviewers. I think that system is terrible. I think it's really bad. I think its downsides outweigh its benefits. And so I'm actually an advocate of abolishing the current peer review system, which is a pretty hardcore position to take for someone in academia. But that's a thing. So that's stuff I argue about. So I'm back. I took a long hiatus. I need a big break just for mental health and to, really. So I've talked about this before. I did 10 years of grad school. I did a master's in philosophy, then a PhD in psychology. I just had massive burnout, and I had one of my first real trips away from everything. And I started this channel towards the tail end of all that. And so now I'm back after a few months of taking some time off. The blog is back, which I started last week. It's also called Lance Independent. If you Google it, you'll find it. Lance Independent, for people that, I don't know if you all know, it's a play on words. It's like Stance Independent, Lance Independent. I don't know if that was obvious to people.
I had no idea. That's a good one.
Yeah, I didn't come up with it. So someone that I know gave me the idea. I don't know if they want me like constantly thanking them. I should ask them because I'd like to give them credit. I like to give people credit. People will notice this if you look at my academic papers. I cite I think my dissertation had like 30 pages of references. It was something insane. So I get really citation happy, which is ironic given that I just said I hate the peer review system. Anyway, so that's just a sort of introduction to me for people that are joining for the first time. And then the other thing is I just hit 1,000 subscribers a couple of days ago. So I'm celebrating that. Let's get more subscribers. So what I'm doing today, normally I just rant for like an hour or two, sometimes 4 hours, and then leave. But today I'm just letting everybody in and we're getting chaotic with it. So yeah, okay. Having said all that, welcome new people that have just joined the stage. I don't know where to take the conversation from there. Maybe we should pick a new topic. I don't know.
Do you mind if I bring something up?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, so that's me, Blamtasticful, in the chat, by the way.
Oh, great. Okay.
It's an old screen name from a way too long ago. But anyways, I wanted to bring up that notion of, moral realism we've been talking about that on the stream, talking about different reasons why a person might be a moral realist. And then I think I brought up this idea that there seems to be, at least, I'm not saying all, but there are some moral realists who, when someone would bring up the consideration that, hey, our moral intuitions don't seem to be the result of, they don't seem to be because our moral intuitions are picking up like on the truth that's out there, that they're the reason why we have moral intuitions is because of other considerations that are like evolutionary and that don't have any need for it to be picking up on truth in any way whatsoever. Now, you don't have to buy that story, but let's say that for the sake of argument, yeah, okay, that's how our intuitions came about. But nonetheless, my intuition that moral realism is true is so strong that outweighs the intuition that, yeah, our moral intuitions are not the result of picking up on the truth. And my whole thought is, I would consider that to be some sort of undercutting defeater, at the very least, for moral realism. And I don't think you just get to say, well, my intuition for moral realism is stronger if you're given reasons why moral intuitions aren't picking up on truth. Do you kind of
Yeah, I don't think that. So let's say you don't endorse phenomenal conservatism, and so what you believe is that if you have some reason to believe something is true, like if something seems true, then that gives you some defeasible reason to believe it's true in the absence of defeaters.
Right.
And then someone comes along and they say, "Hey, I've got an evolutionary debunking argument. I've got some defeater." They propose a defeater for realism. Yeah, one response is, yeah, but my intuition that realism is true is so strong, like, too bad. They could do that. Another thing they can do is to respond to the defeater, is to say, no, I actually have defeaters for your defeater. So that is probably how most philosophers, I would expect Hume and others would say, yeah, it's not, I don't like accept evolutionary debunking arguments as like correct and then still endorse realism. I reject the arguments. And then they would give reasons why they reject them. So I don't think that they're like that. I don't think that's an issue, but you do get something pretty strange, which is that realists will often say things like any argument against moral realism will rely on premises that are less plausible than the claim that moral realism is true. So you do get stuff like that where so what they're doing in those cases is notice what they're saying. The arguments for against moral realism that are supposed to serve as the defeaters have premises that they think are less plausible than that realism is not true. And so in these cases, they're implying they're going to reject the premises in their argument somewhere. So I don't really think that they're not like stuck with a problem here. Do you still think there's a problem?
So maybe I guess I could say that this position that I've heard from some moral realists is not as widespread possibly as I've thought. But there's I don't know, how much do you follow T-Jump's content? He had a moral realist philosopher on recently who kind of takes that approach that I mentioned. And I really don't think that's kind of what he said on stream. And then would you just say that's a fundamentally flawed approach and that the better approach is just to respond to the premises in evolutionary debunking arguments and to say that I find premises in favor of moral realism more plausible than the premises in favor of evolutionary debunking arguments?
Yeah, so basically I think that so you have a couple replies. One is like you could call it Morian foot stomping, which is to just say realism just seems super duper true. And I kind of make fun of this in my epistemic blank checks blog post where it's like, you say, I think realism is true and phenomenal conservatism is correct. And let's just say the other people agree. And so like, I'm justified in believing it's true unless you give me defeaters. And someone goes, here's your defeaters. And then you go, but you don't understand. It's super duper true. Like my intuition overrides. People do react that way. Are they wrong? Are they making a mistake when they like, what if they're accurately reporting their phenomenology? And what if they're what if it's not just that if something seems true, that's a feasible reason to believe it's true? What if the stronger something, like it emits of some quantifiable quality, the stronger it seems true, the more overriding that is. If you add that, and like you actually agree with that, it doesn't look like they're making a mistake. And you could recast that in Bayesian terms and just say, look, if you have a really strong prior, then no amount of evidence is going to push your credence back towards disbelief.
Yeah, but that means that you can just like make the prior like I don't want to like curse, but like you can make it like just like too high for like any like plausible or even like unplausible argument to make to even come close to being defeated, you know?
Right.
That's why I usually see like these like conservative the phenomenal conservatism as like being like essentially, I think you've put it this way as well, phenomenal dogmatism. It's actually like a very nice description of like general way as I see those types of responses.
So what happens if your prior asymptotically approaches 1? In other words, you have a prior. In other words, to put this in like basic terms, what if someone says, hey, how likely do you think it is realism is true? And you say, I think the probability is 99.9999999, like, and let you do that for an hour percent. The chance that it's true. Okay, well, now people could give you, arguments, like good arguments all day long. They could just line up, all 8 billion whatever people on the planet could line up, give you arguments against realism all day until the end of time. And every single argument could be the most devastating argument any human has ever given another human all day long. And they could do that until the heat death of the universe, and it still wouldn't be enough to overcome that prior. Now, is your prior 100%? No, you are technically capable of being presented with sufficient evidence for you to change your mind, but you wouldn't. So what do we do about that situation? My concern with this appeal to phenomenal conservatism is that while the principle looks extremely modest, it looks conservative. It looks like a very simple, straightforward. It's like it's not saying too much. In practice, a lot of people employ it in a way where they look incorrigible and they elevate their sort of de facto or functional incorrigibility to a sort of like epistemic virtue. Like look, it really is true. It seems true. So probably is true unless you give me other reasons to think otherwise. You're foisting the entire burden of the discussion onto everybody else. And you're setting yourself up as a judge that gets to appeal to like a secret cheat sheet for how much the evidence stacks up. So, imagine there was a courtroom and let's say it's not a jury trial, it's a judge trial. Like what is it called? A bench trial or something. The judge is going to decide on the case. And so the prosecution presents the case, the defense presents the case, and the defense presents an extraordinary amount of evidence that the person is like not guilty of whatever the crime is. And then the prosecution's like, we don't think they did it. or sorry, no, the prosecution. The prosecution says, no, but we think they're guilty. We really super duper feel that way. And that's all they say. We just super duper, like, we have this strong feeling that they're guilty. And the defense is like, what are you talking? We established they have like 17, they have an alibi. We have like 17 pieces of forensic evidence that shows that someone else probably did it. Like, we have a ton of evidence. And so the judge is given all that. And then the judge says, okay, now I have all this evidence and we agree. There's tons and tons of evidence that the person is not guilty. And the prosecution has presented very minimal evidence, but I'm going to now appeal to my seemings. And no one can see their seemings and they go, yeah, guilty. Would anyone find that remotely acceptable? I think the answer would be no. We want the kinds of evidence that the judge is going to use to make that decision to be publicly evaluable. We want to be able to look at that evidence. And it doesn't have to be like physical evidence. They can make arguments. Why would they do that? Given their motivations, they could appeal to circumstantial evidence or something. But the point is, we want it to be valuable to us. But when philosophers appeal to these seemings, what are they doing? They're appealing to private evidence. The strength of how much more realism seems true to the realist is not, I can't access that to see if they're accurately reporting that. It's not accessible to me. So I just have to take their word for it. And I'm happy to do that. I'm happy to take their word for it. If the realist says, realism seems so obviously true, no arguments you've given me could plausibly override how strong it seems true to be, okay, then it seems true to you.
Well, let me.
Why should I?
Can I respond though? Because I think to the point about is the moral foot stomping, is it really wrong? It's like, well, maybe in a super duper conservative sense, maybe it's not, but in a public sense, it's a problem. But so another thought experiment I like to use, which is one thing we learn in psychology is that people think they are much better at interviewing and finding out if a person will be a good candidate for a job than they actually do. And I know because you've been in the psychological literature, you've heard that come up at some point in time. Nonetheless, managers tend to have very strong intuitions, at least not necessarily all managers, but a lot of them do think they are decent interviewers, that they're good at figuring out what candidates might be best for the job or not. So we can think of this in the thought experiment. Let's say that a person is like 95%, a manager's 95% convinced that they are good at finding the best candidate for the job based off of the pool of interviewees. Let's say that. And then you give them evidence, like empirical evidence, like scientifically empirical evidence that, oh, guess what? It turns out that you are not actually good at interviewing. And not only is that true generally speaking, but we can actually show, hey, that you are missing out on good people. And we can show your track record of times where you hired people who were not good for the job. And then they said back to you, no, but listen, I have this 95%, I have this intuition that's like so 95%, confident that I'm a really good interviewer. And I guess what I would say to the moral realist is would you think that manager is giving a justified response? Or if you don't want to use that language, you could say, in some meaningful sense of the word reasonable, do you think what they're doing is reasonable? And then basically what I would say is if they say no, I would ask them, why do you think it's justified in the case of the moral realist with their moral intuitions? And if they say, no, I don't think they would be justified, then my question would be is, in what way would you think that your case, your beliefs, your moral intuitions are not like this case example? And so that's kind of the pushback that I feel like you could still give to a moral realist on that moral foot stomping point.
Have you tried that in a conversation with anybody?
I don't get on live streams as much as I used to, so I've done some in the chat, but I don't think I've ever had a conversation with that, especially like the moral realist that I'm thinking of about that issue in particular, I should say.
How do you think a realist would respond?
I think a realist, I'm not sure how a realist would respond. My guess is that their instinct, if they are like if they're don't want to let go of moral realism, was we try to find some disanalogy between the interview case and the moral intuition case. That would be my first instinct. I think it's, I don't know. What do you think?
Well, I'm eating dinner, so I'm trying to put the work onto you.
Oh, fair enough. Sorry, man.
So that's why I had the camera off.
Yeah. So I think they would, that at least, I don't know. I haven't done an empirical example of like what they would do. Or the other option I think is just, I don't know, maybe they could do some hand waving. I'm trying to think of something else other than just disagreeing to the disanalogy. If you could say, I think that's, I think that yes, maybe they could say, yes, I think the manager is justified in their belief. And then maybe the point would just be is, do you think that is very meaningful to say that they are justified in their belief in that case? And then if they said like, yes, then I guess we would have hit intuitional bedrock and we would just disagree on that point. But
yeah, you might. So
yeah.
they might push a disanalogy and try to find some like, reason why that comparison isn't really relevant. They could also, just bite, like you could say, I hate that phrase, bite the bullet. So they could just think, exactly what you suggested, that the person is justified. But what they might do, and this maybe is an example of the first, when moral realists are challenged on a lot of these issues, a lot of times what I find that they do is they appeal to expertise. Like they are good judges of these sorts of things. And if you're going to give some other case, maybe those people aren't good judges, or maybe those people are given compelling defeaters, but they could say, look, I'm a good judge of this sort of thing, and I haven't been given good defeaters.
I guess in what sense would we say they're a good judge? Like, I'm not even sure what that would mean exactly.
Yeah, well, that's precisely the point of like contention,
Well, yeah. So philosophers will say stuff like, in virtue of my training, education, and expertise, and the fact that I'm a member of like the human species and in this linguistic community, I have a good sense of how the language works. So, a realist might say, look, we don't need all this experimental philosophy stuff to see whether people are moral realists or not. We could just analyze sentences, and we could see there's the Frege-Geach problem. There's other sorts of linguistic problems that emotivism and non-cognitivist accounts have, so we can toss those out. Do people talk like relativists? No, they don't talk like relativists. Do people talk like error theorists? No, that would make no sense. Like, what are they all fictionalists? That's ridiculous. So we could throw out all of the standard sorts of semantic theses that are inconsistent with realism. So now we can say, look, when people go around speaking and talking and doing the sorts of things they do, engaging in moral judgment behavior, they're already implicitly presupposing that realism is true. Like, that's just how people are. It's a common sense view. And that view is just like our view that the world exists, or that 2 + 2 = 4. It's just another one of those things that's just freaking obvious. And so if you're going to override that, you're going to need some damn good evidence. And you just don't have that. And it's not just that it's obvious and it's a very commonsensical view. It's that, look, I have gone further than just trusting my commonsensical judgments. I've studied this topic, and I've looked at the arguments for realism and the arguments against realism. And the arguments against realism just aren't that good. And like, they could point to the arguments and tell you why they're not that good. And you know what? I would probably agree with him. I don't think like the argument from disagreement or Mackey's argument from queerness are all that compelling of arguments. And so what they could say is, I look out over the academic literature on this topic, and it corroborates my common sense intuitions. I don't see compelling arguments against the view, and I've studied the topic a whole lot. It still seems true to me. If anything, it seems truer than it did before. Why should I take skepticism seriously? So you don't feel like it's true? So what? I think that's the kind of thing that they might try to push, is to try to make a point that from their point of view, there's tables and trees and chairs and moral facts, and you just haven't given them any compelling reason to think that's not the case.
So let me ask this then. I think it's an important question. So let's say I grant, for example, that if it is in fact the case that is the way their intuitions are, and let's set aside for a moment, what the heck intuitions are, but let's say that there's some sort of, we have to appeal to them, in at least practically speaking. So it's not completely throw out the notion of intuition, but one of the things that I does come to mind is questioning either if they are like somehow wrong, if a philosopher could somehow be wrong about their intuition. So like maybe they are inaccurately but not maliciously saying that they have the intuition that moral facts exist, but somehow that's not the case. Or what a more extreme example is, I don't see what's wrong with a philosopher just being skeptical of the fact that maybe they're willingly deceiving themselves in some sense. I mean, it's kind of tough because it's at the problem of disagreement, right? Because if something seems like, so if, let's say, an evolutionary debunking argument seems very, very, very reasonable to you, and it just doesn't make sense that someone else wouldn't see why it's so reasonable, the question would be are you justified, given certain, experiences with moral realists, that some moral realists, are kind of, they're not exemplifying a lot of the, intellectual virtues, epistemic virtues that you would expect. And so that, maybe we should come to the conclusion that moral realists aren't necessarily giving, it's tough to say not fully honest, but maybe that's the case, that maybe their assessment isn't, at the very least, isn't very virtuous. At the worst, it isn't very, it isn't fully honest. What would you think about a moral anti-realist coming to that conclusion?
So you initially said something like, isn't it like, it sounds like you said something like, isn't it possible that they're engaged in some type of self-deception? Is that right?
Yes, but I would say more than is it possible. So maybe you might infer from certain behaviors, or maybe it's just you think that you're inferring that since, more evolutionary debunking, the premises in evolutionary debunking arguments are so convincing to you that it's hard for you to see why it wouldn't be convincing to someone else. So you're inferring that other people do in fact find it convincing, but somehow they're thinking around those premises in some sort of way, shape, or form.
Right, but so from the realist point of view, they're just going to say, look, sure, I could be I could be subject to some type of self. Maybe they would argue they can't be. That would be a whole thing. Maybe they need to argue for why. But let's just say, yeah, sure, maybe I'm deceiving myself. Why should I think that I am? And then you would have to actually convince them of that. Do you have a way of doing that? Like, what would that look like?
Well, remember,
it looks like everything that follows is based on a claim that may or may not be true, and that they're probably not going to accept, right?
Well, right. Well, here's the question, because we've been kind of bending over backwards to ask, are the moral realists, in some sense justified in that position, we've just been talking about this this Morian foot stomping. And my question is, it seems at the very least that option is available to the anti-realist when it comes to believing that realists are self-deceived, but also we didn't address the fact that they could be self-deceived, or let's say they're not being fully honest. So like maybe in some way they do in fact know that the premises for evolutionary debunking arguments are convincing, but nonetheless they choose to argue in favor of moral realism. Do you see what I'm getting at? So again,
Yeah,
but you can't impugn every moral realist like that, but it could be the case at the very least. And you could argue that and self-deception seem more plausible in the idea that they truly have an intuition that the premises for moral realism are stronger than the premises for evolutionary debunking arguments.
Right, but it might seem more plausible to you, but it's not going to seem more plausible to them. So how do you square that issue? So if you say, look, when I look at the way that moral realists talk and speak and whatever, it looks to me more plausible that they are self-deceived about their own phenomenological reports. Like they're misreporting their phenomenology due to some subtle type of self-deception that's not introspectively accessible to them or whatever. Okay, so they might say, yeah, sure, okay, maybe it seems that way to you. Maybe that's true. Why should I think that that's true? And so you would be in a very similar situation to the realist. If the realist says, yeah, it seems like it's true.
Agreed.
You should believe it's true. Like you could say, okay, well, where's the publicly valuable evidence? Like my judge scenario, you're standing in the same situation. How it seems to you isn't publicly valuable evidence. Now, if you showed, let's say in principle, we had really good, well-developed neuroscientific data like fMRI research, and we actually could say, yeah, certain types of brain activity correlate with self-deception and anti-correlate, like they're negatively correlated with like when people are being sincere or whatever. And so we could actually know from looking at brain activity what sorts of states correlate with self-deception or not. And then we take a bunch of moral realists and we throw them in an fMRI machine, and then we ask them a bunch of questions, and then it comes up that when they're reporting that they're realists, you're getting the brain activity for like that's associated with self-deception. that doesn't guarantee. It could be that the brain activity just happens to be similar, even though it's not. So you're not going to get a perfect correlation. So there would be some type of empirical evidence consistent with the hypothesis that they're subject to self-deception. That is the kind of evidence that I think they would be receptive to. And I think it's appropriate for them to say, yeah, if you want to say I'm self-deceived, present me good reasons to think I'm self-deceived. If you're going to tell me it just seems plausible to you that I'm self-deceived, so what? I mean, think about like what like Christian apologists might say. They might say, everybody deep down knows God exists and you're just deceiving yourselves and you're being dishonest. I don't find that remotely compelling. I have access to what's in my mind. I'm not being dishonest. Maybe I'm self-deceived in a way that's not introspectively accessible. And if they were going to insist on that, like, okay, if the Christian apologist says, Lance, I know that you're consciously lying about your disbelief. I know that's not true. So like, that's not going to be compelling to me at all. I'd laugh at that.
Right, but that doesn't mean that other people can't be consciously lying.
Oh, sure. But the point would just be, if they are, like you would want to present evidence of that if you're trying to persuade an audience. Now, if you're arguing with a realist that is lying and you're like, I think you're lying, maybe some of them are going, yeah, well, I am. But that I don't think that's going to be like dialectically.
Well, actually, I was going to make a point about the dialectic as well. Because my point is, it seems to me that it's dialectically important to point out that me having those beliefs, that that the moral realists in their let's say their Morian foot stomping is just as justified in believing that moral realism is true on the basis of their Morian foot stomping as I am in my beliefs. If in contingent on the fact that to me it seems to be the case that the arguments in favor of moral realists being self-deceived and not being fully honest with themselves, that it seems to me that it strongly seems to be that that's more likely to be the case than that moral realism is true. Like, that's the same position. You both can be justified in that position, and the point being is that doesn't really speak volumes to what should be convincing to people based off of the publicly available evidence. Like, all it's saying is, hey, it seems to me this way. Hey, it seems to you that way. And that's really all that we're saying. We're not saying anything when it comes to how reasonable it is for other people to believe that moral realism is true, or that moral realists are self-deceived or not being fully honest.
I guess I'm losing sight of what point you're trying to make here. I mean, just before you respond to that, a realist could they could psychologize an anti-realist too. They could say anti-realists are conceptually confused, or they, like some have said, that I have, like, because I don't just say I don't accept realism. I actually think certain, like, non-natural realism is unintelligible. I've had people just float the hypothesis that I have brain damage. They're like, yeah, so the part of your brain that is for my functioning moral faculties to recognize realism is true doesn't work in your brain. Maybe you got hit in the head. So like, they'll put forward that, and it's basically they would have a parallel maneuver to make, which is to just psychologize the anti-realist. And who would win the psychologizing hypothesis battle? I don't know.
Right,
if you're trying to appeal to
but here's my point is, we can do that, right? But we could also say the same thing. So let's bring up like someone who is genuinely convinced, the earth is flat. And I mean, there's people who are genuinely convinced of that, and we could also have that back and forth. Are they justified in a phenomenally conservative sense, that the earth is flat? And then I could say, or maybe you're, self-deceived, or you're often lying to yourself, and they could say, or maybe the same thing about me. But we could say something that doesn't mean that we can grant, equal plausibility to both of those things. So I would just say that just because both sides can say that they are convinced of their positions and that they're justified in that on the basis of their sayings, that shouldn't necessarily stop other people from being persuaded more one way or another way, right? So I think my point is kind of in one sense coming around to what you're saying, which is this doesn't seem to say much about publicly what one person should be swayed towards one way or another. All it just shows is that, hey, it seems to you that your position is true. It seems to me that my position is true. And then we'd have to do an empirical study to figure out what other people find to be more persuasive as far as their intuitions are concerned.
Pretty much, yeah. So I do think that if look, part of the issue is this notion of justification. Like, are they justified? What does that even mean? Like, I don't care about justification. Once we understand that what we're talking about, justification-wise, is describing the relation between facts about people's psychology and facts about the evidence they've been presented with and how those relate to one another, we're dealing with a bunch of descriptive facts about the comparative incorrigibility or corrigibility of different agents that have different sort of default settings. So you take a person that has a default setting that it's like almost certain that realism is true. You give them a piece of evidence and they still think realism is true. You give another person with their default setting as realism is not true. You give them the same evidence. They think it's even more not true. No one's beliefs have been changed. But what is causing them to change or not change is a question of default settings and the cognitive faculties of the given agents. If justification is fundamentally inextricably tangled up in facts about the psychology of the agents, which I think it is, what we're dealing with is like a descriptive fact, like a set of descriptive considerations about how agents change their minds. So I don't think there's anything substantive or interesting there. You could just program an agent that is incapable of being convinced realism is false. Is it making an intellectual mistake? Not relative to its priors. So, like, no, not in a certain sense. If you're going to say that it's not modeling the world accurately, you could say that. But we just have to be precise about what it is that we're wanting to say. I think that a lot of the considerations that you're putting forward are ways of, from my perspective, motivating a parallel case that an anti-realist could make for doubting a realist. I suspect realists might grant most of that. They might. So, like, one thing that will typically happen is if I say to realists, look, it seems to me that realism is not true. So am I justified in believing that in the absence of defeaters? Typically they say, yeah, sure. So, like, they don't typically have a huge problem with us being at an impasse on those grounds or on like psychological grounds. So, they could hypothesize what's going wrong with me and I could hypothesize what's going wrong with them. Ultimately, if we want to settle that, we're going to need to get into the empirical evidence. I don't know how receptive realists would be to that. It's going to vary from realist to realist, just like it would with anti-realists. It's not like every anti-realist is like a mega empiricist like me. Some of them are just going to be super mega ultra analytic and theoretical and not really care about studies very much. They do tend to care more, in my experience, on average. Like Richard Joyce has a whole book called, so Richard Joyce is a prominent contemporary error theorist. There's a whole book called Evolution of Morality. Maybe it's The Evolution of Morality. And it has a whole bunch of empirical stuff. So some of them seem to care more than some realists, but you have the whole contingent of naturalist realists. They clearly care about the empirical facts. So yeah, I think that if we're stuck at that kind of impasse, it's going to come down to the arguments and appeals people are already making. So realists make their arguments, Hume's argument from convergence, the ontological argument, and then anti-realists are going to trot out their arguments. I don't think they're very good either. So we're back where we started.
Yeah, I guess one more point, because I did bring up, I think, a contentious idea. So you mentioned that, we could all, make our just so stories on why our opponents, why they're incorrect about their intuitions, and vice versa. But I want to say that I think in principle, right, it should be fine. Because I've gotten this notion from some philosophers that to bring up the notion that someone could be dishonest, like someone who is, let's say, philosophically literate, philosophically publishing, some sort of philosopher, that bringing that up, it shouldn't be done because it's, in a sense, not dialectically useful, because all it does is make your interlocutors angry, and then they're gonna accuse each other back and forth of different things, and it's just not useful to the conversation. But I want to say is, like, in principle, it doesn't seem like one should be able just to rule out that, in fact, some beliefs are the result, some positions are the result of people sometimes not being fully honest or sometimes being quite dishonest. And just something, I just thought from, like, do you think philosophically it's out of line to ever accuse, I guess, philosophers, realists, intuitions of some sort of dishonesty in some sort of way, shape, or form?
I wouldn't say it's never acceptable. What if I have a private email exchange that's released to the public that a realist is like, haha, I know my arguments are crap, but I'm going to pretend that like they're totally just clearly lying in a private email exchange or text messages or whatever, then sure, they're lying. It's like you have direct empirical evidence that they're lying. But no, I don't tend to think realists are lying. I don't have that attitude. I don't think realists are any more disposed towards dishonesty than anybody else. I don't think that they're intentionally being dishonest in most cases. But the thing is, let's say that there were cases, well, a couple things. One, I have been repeatedly accused of being dishonest, disingenuous, lying, pretending about my views. And I know that I'm not. And it really pisses me off. It pisses me off a lot. So I have a couple rules for interactions with people. One is that if you accuse me of lying and I'm not lying, I will not talk to you, like ever. You're done. And the second is if you try to tell me what my views are, that's not going to fly. So I've had exchanges where I'm like, hey, I don't think that. And someone's like, yes, you do. And I'm like, no, I do not think that. And they're like, you do think that. No. If you can't take my word for it, we can't have a productive discussion. Like, you know, because you're speaking for you and then you're speaking for me. So there's no point in me speaking. I could just leave and you can make up what you think I think. There's no point in talking to me. So the thing about that is the moment you accuse someone of dishonesty, you're not having the conversation about the topic anymore. You're having a meta discussion. And the meta discussion is about psychological facts that you probably don't have access to. Like, we're not going to have private email exchanges. I don't have access to the private contents of anybody's brain. You know, not until we get mind reading devices. So it's why even go there? Like, I tend to not even go there. When I engage in discussions, I presume people are operating in good faith unless I have concrete substantive reasons to think that they're not. And if the person is being an asshole, that doesn't mean I think they're being dishonest. If the person is dodging my questions, I don't even think that means they're being dishonest. I am very reluctant to presume a person is being dishonest. And even when I suspect that they might be being disingenuous or dishonest, I still just treat them as if they're being honest. And I think that that's probably the better approach to these sorts of things, because it's very easy for us to get frustrated with someone that we think is dodging our questions or being evasive or being tricky, or they conveniently misremember things that we said or distort what we said or seem to contradict themselves or actually contradict themselves. It's very easy to think, for instance, if someone said something to you and then 5 minutes later you're like, well, earlier you said this, and they go, no, I didn't. I've seen people in discussions do that. And then someone goes, you're lying. That's ridiculous. People forget what they said. Why presume they are lying rather than think maybe they forgot what they said? I forget what I say all the time. I forget what I ate yesterday. I don't know. What was I doing yesterday? Let me think. I would have to stop and think. I don't know. I don't know. So why not just assume good faith and have like a very high threshold for someone crossing the line? That's how I tend to prefer to operate.
Here's the thing, though. I think that's more of a practical consideration. So let's consider like a legal precedent, right? Like innocent before being proven guilty, right? Is that like the way to get the most accurate results on average? Not necessarily. It just means that we value the notion of someone not being put behind bars when we just have a higher threshold for that. We value innocent people not going to jail more than we value guilty people going to prison. At least that's the way I would. I think you could cash out innocent before proven guilty. I think it's a reasonable way of cashing out.
So like in principle, so you could have like false positives, which is you put a person in prison and they didn't really do it, and false negatives, which is you fail to put a person in prison even though they did do it. And the legal system tends to favor like it's not like, hey, let's optimize the lowest total number of false positives and false negatives combined.
Right.
That is not how the legal system operates. It operates on saying, yeah, false positives are much worse than false negatives. It's more okay to have X amount of false negatives than a false positive. And so the legal system is biased towards, at least in principle, of course, how it operates in practice is everybody has to make a plea deal because you don't want to risk getting screwed in a court. So never mind all the actual intricacies of the real problems with legal systems. But in principle, like the like innocent until proven guilty or whatever, it's structured in a way so as, you know, again, ideally or in principle to not to basically assign greater weight to the bad caused by a false positive than a false negative. And so it's actually not trying to optimize for accuracy. It's actually optimizing for some sort of balanced thing. So I just readily admit, yeah, that's how I'm operating. So there are cases where I might think a person is being dishonest or manipulative or disingenuous or whatever, and I'm still just going to treat them like they're not. And it's not because I think that they're not. It's because I don't think introducing that into the conversation is a valuable way to proceed. I also am well aware that I have so many biases against people. I'm really bad at reading people. People sometimes in Facebook conversations, they look like they're being rude to me. And then if I like talk to them in person or on video, they're perfectly friendly. Now, maybe they were being rude and they changed their attitude, but it's also possible I can't read their tone and I just misread it. I'm so aware of, again, like people falsely accusing me of being disingenuous and lying that it would feel really gross for me to accuse other people of that. It would seem super hypocritical and obnoxious. And I don't want to be an obnoxious hypocrite. So there is that. Never mind accuracy. I'm okay with losing a bit of accuracy and not accusing someone who's lying in order to not be an obnoxious hypocrite. I'm totally willing to make that trade.
Maybe that speaks more towards my values as well. So just kind of putting my cards on the table a little bit, and then maybe after that, someone else can jump in because I feel like I've been talking for a while. But so you brought up an example, right? That let's say a theist, or specifically like a Christian theist, could come up with a belief. The only reason, like, why you are not a Christian, or you believe God does not exist, is because you want to sin, or like the eyes, like you've been darkened, you know, and so you're not able to. So you can come up with some sort of Christian story, right? From my perspective, I want to know that if somebody genuinely thinks that's the case. So, like, yeah, in some sense, it might piss me off, but I value more knowing that. And so, like, I can talk to that person being like, you know what, I can understand from where you're standing why you would think that's the case. All I can do is to say, listen, man, try to convince you as best as I can that I'm being genuine, and just getting you to consider that, hey, you know, sometimes people giving other like counterexamples of why, you know, you might think someone else is being genuine, even though there's things you can do to try to just to convince them otherwise, I guess. And I would rather know that. And I guess I also tend to lean towards this idea that I think in some cases we do have decent reasons to infer that people are dishonest, and maybe I guess my threshold for that is going to be for kind of going out and thinking that's the case is lower maybe than for you. And that could be some of the reasons behind why we feel a little bit differently on that matter.
Yeah. So there's 2 points. I have a higher threshold for inferring that a person is being dishonest. And that's because I know that there are many, many ways in which a person could be, again, like they forget something. That like people will accuse someone, like a person contradicts themselves and then is like, no, I didn't. And people will say they're lying. People just lose track of their own views. And so there's lots of, just to bundle all of those features together, there's a bunch of quirks and eccentricities about human psychology that can account for why people are saying erroneous things, making mistakes, appearing evasive, and so on and so forth, that are not, they're not definitive evidence that the person is being dishonest. They're something else is going on. Confused, forgetful, that sort of thing. So there's that. So I have a pretty damn high threshold for thinking someone's being dishonest. Then the second is that I favor this sort of like innocent until proven guilty thing. I'm going to assume people are being good faith until they're proven guilty beyond, you know, reasonable doubt. Just to draw on the analogy, maybe my standard isn't quite that high, but it's pretty damn high. I need a high standard. The third are the practical consequences. So let's say someone passes my threshold. I really think they're being dishonest. And then also, like, you know, I think they're being dishonest. And what was my second? Like, I'm losing track of the things I just said.
That's okay.
They either forget some of their points and they
yeah. So never mind the psychology stuff. I think they're being dishonest, right? And then there's the second threshold is whether I bring that up in the conversation. And the thing about that is, think about the practical consequences. Let's say I was interviewing some philosopher and we had a contrary view, just to remove realists from it. And we're arguing about free will or something, just because I don't know who I would be arguing about with free will. This is a nameless person. We're arguing about free will, and I'm convinced the person's lying. What should I do if I'm in a live video like this? Should I say, I think you're lying right now? Now, think about what that is going to do. One, that conversation is going down the drain immediately. The conversation's over. It's not going to be a fun conversation for either of us. So I'm going to ruin my conversation. The other thing is, who the hell is going to want to talk to me if they risk in the middle of a live stream me accusing them of being dishonest? It's like imagine if every once in a while I brought out evidence that they were like secretly a criminal or something. Like no one's going to want to talk to me. And so I'm totally just jettisoning my ability to have positive relationships with people. You're making yourself seem like a risky, dangerous person to talk to. And so the other thing you have to just think about are the practical consequences of just saying whatever it is you think. I have interacted with people that I think are assholes. Like I'm not saying that they're dishonest. I'm saying I think the person's a jerk. And I typically don't say so. Like I'm not going to say in the middle of a conversation, "Hey, how come you're being a slimy weasel jerk?" Because that's
Well, though I feel like
one is I could be.
I feel like
Again, just to emphasize, one is I could just be wrong.
Yeah.
Like I'm wrong about this stuff. Not everybody that I think is an asshole is an asshole. Sometimes I'm the asshole. So there's that, and then like, what is the consequences of just blurting out whatever I think about people privately?
But I think you also have to worry about emperor's clothes situation as well. So like I often find a lot of people will not want to say it to someone's face for those reasons, but then like they'll say it anyways behind their back, and I'm like, I don't think that's much better. Like, and here's the thing: if you truly do believe the case, and let's say in your case it's above your threshold, right? So you have a very high threshold. You have things above. It would be really sad to me, like if a bunch of people had that experience or thought that was the case, and yet nobody said it whatsoever, and like you really thought that was the case. And I guess one more thought is, I can see what you're saying, especially on maybe disagreements that you found more contentious, right? So maybe you don't think you think that person's dishonest, but maybe you think other people are not dishonest and they have genuine disagreements, like on free will or some other philosophical topic, right? But then there could be other topics, and I'll just bring up theism. So I can speak from my experience and say that when I was a theist, there's times you get into heated online discussions. And let's say you do believe like that God exists, you do believe in Christianity, right? But maybe you think actually that the arguments for it are not as strong as like you claim them to be. Like maybe you're saying it's super clear and so you're lying about your confidence level, right? And maybe you say, ultimately, I had a personal experience of Jesus Christ, and that's why I believe. I can't really explain it. I'm not saying it's going to be convincing, but for some reason, it gives me comfort and stuff. But the actual arguments, you feel like, I could see people going one way or another. To me, it's about a wash. But you could represent yourself. And that's something I remember I used to do. And then the question would be could you infer that other people are doing that as a result of that? And can you look for markers? And maybe, again, you're like, well, listen, there could be a lot of noise there. You could be looking at things that you think, hey, this might mean that they're like that. But ultimately, that could mean something else as well. But I think you could come to the conclusion that they're based off of some behavior that, people are more like me than you're not as special as you think you are, that there's other human beings across. It's probably not likely that you're the only one who's acted like that. And to put that out there that, hey, this confidence being, you can kind of discount how much people purporting they are this confident about arguments for the existence of God. You can discount how much weight you give that. And I don't think that would necessarily be a bad way of approaching these kinds of conversations. Maybe that wouldn't convince somebody else, but it seems like it's an okay rationale, at least from where I'm standing.
Yeah, I'm especially sensitive to that first point. What if a person, and that, let's say we're dealing with like a philosophical community or whatever, like there's, again, to go with our hypothetical free will advocate, where there's no plausible candidate where I could be insulting somebody or saying something mean about an actual person. Because again, I don't know who this person would be. Let's say there's a free will philosopher, they go around arguing for compatibilism. I would typically argue probably more against libertarian free will, so we'll go with compatibilism. But they just go around arguing for compatibilism, and they're a huge, interpersonally, they're just nasty to everybody. And everybody goes, oh, well, this person is like famous or popular or very well liked, so we can't say anything about this person, and they all do what I'm doing, and so no one calls them out. Yeah, that's bad, and that's unfortunate. And I don't know what the solution to that is, because it's a collective action problem where,
fair enough,
am I going to personally instantiate the kind of norm I wish we would live with, which is that what you should be able to do is publicly say to this free will advocate or whatever, let's say it's a free will skeptic, and I just happen to disagree on the type of free will skepticism. We say to them, hey, I think you're kind of being a jerk. We should talk about this. It'd be nice if I could say that without that having horrible repercussions for me personally and professionally. And it'd be great if the person would be receptive. Oh, I didn't think I was being a jerk. Why do you think I'm being a jerk? And then you have that conversation, and then like 50 other people will come out and go, "Oh my God, I'm glad you said it. Yeah, you're totally being a jerk all the time." That'd be great. But you have the collective action problem. Do I want to be the person like actually in the real world to stick my neck out? It's going to depend on the behavior. Like if a person is like a little bit of a douchebag, I'm probably not going to do something. If the person is like fabricating data or threatening people, yeah, now I might, and I think that I should, even if that causes a problem. Like I certainly think you should expose people that are like legitimately committing crimes or doing awful things. And it's easy for me to say that in the abstract. It's hard in some cases to do it in practice. Like obviously, if I saw a philosopher that's like, I'm going to start tying my philosophical rivals to trolleys and run real world trolley. Okay, I'm reporting the person. It's not a big deal. I could easily report. Well, the action is a big deal. It's not going to be challenging for me to report them because that's like now they're a super villain or something. Hopefully not so super. We could stop them. But, there are going to be situations where any effort you make to try to do the right thing carries enormous risks, and I understand why people are sensitive to those risks. Whistleblowers routinely get screwed, and a lot of times, when it comes to like exposing academic misconduct or fraud or that sort of thing, like people that I'm thinking a lot of cases in psychology where people have found that someone is committing data fabrication or data manipulation or that sort of thing. You call attention to that behavior. A lot of times the university the person works at is super reluctant and hesitant to do anything about it. Their supervisors might be reluctant and hesitant. Journals can be a real pain in the ass to try and get stuff retracted. Like it might take them years and a bunch of people hassling them. It's not like the moment you say, hey, that person, I think they're fabricating data, everyone goes, yeah, let's get them. Let's find out the truth. People get weird and people will defend their careers. And, there's a lot of stuff that, again, describing it in the abstract, it's really easy. But in practice, it could be that this person has a position of power or influence or control over you and your life and your future. Like what if you're a grad student and your advisor is doing something bad? What do you do? Because if you expose them, maybe nothing happens other than it causes a problem for you and they continue doing it. Now, let's just say you get them in trouble. Let's say they lose tenure and they get fired and all this stuff. Okay. What's going to happen to you? Now, if it was me accepting graduate students, I hope I would be the kind of person that would say, that student has integrity. And I would say, please come work for me. I would hope. But that person could be seen as radioactive in the area that they're in. Who wants to have that troublemaker, And unfortunately, that's how people treat whistleblowers, and it sucks. So basically what I'm saying is there are all these power dynamics and complications and nuances and context-specific details in any given instance in which you could call attention to bad behavior. And it's a tough call. And how much reasonable risk can we expect individuals to take? Where they're risking, like, let's say they do the assessment. And they're like, yeah, 70% chance I ruin my career, 30% chance this person's brought to justice.
Right. So what you're saying
should they do it?
Yeah. So what you're saying is that you're a Marxist. No. I'm just joking. No, I'm actually super sympathetic to what you just said there. So it's funny, right? So if I look at someone like a figure like Martin Luther King Jr. or like Rosa Parks or something, there is a sense in which I really do admire what it is that they did. It took a lot of courage. They made a lot of change. And it came to a lot of times, Martin Luther King Jr. ended up getting shot. So he didn't, and at least some metrics, did not have very good outcomes for the actions he did in his life. And yet I think we all understand reasons why we kind of admire some of the things that he did. And maybe people would disagree. And it's funny, like you can think of even a more extreme example, World War II, the person jumps on the grenade for his buddies. It's like, is that really something that if I was thinking it through, I wouldn't necessarily do? Now, maybe my instincts would kick in, and I just care about my buddies and I would do something like that. But this idea of I can understand why I would admire someone like Dr. King, or admire someone like Rosa Parks. And yet, if I was in that situation, I don't know if I would do the same thing that they did because of those personal cost considerations like you were mentioning. And I don't have a good answer to that. Like, I hate to say it, if I was going to be completely honest, I think there's a lot of decent arguments towards, and I'm speaking for myself personally. So what people would consider to be cowardly, I'm like, well, listen, it's cowardly, but at the same time, I don't think that the actions that are considered brave rather than cowardly are in my best interest. And so I don't see much reason for doing those things.
Yeah, it's not always cowardly or selfish either, though. So, if a person thinks they could do more good by not causing a fuss at every opportunity where they could, people talk about, is this the hill you want to die on? I don't think people should feel like they're obligated to die in every single hill. There's concessions and ground we give to other people in various contexts. A person being a little bit of a jerk is not like, every time I'm interviewing someone or having a debate and I think the person's being a little weaselly or something, and I might just go, oh, you're going to be a greasy weasel in this debate, and I think you're being dishonest. Look, every time I see this, every time I see people do this, it just makes the discussions awful. Like, it ruins the discussion, and I don't want to see those discussions myself, and no one wants to see them. And sorry, some people want to see that stuff. People like to go on these debate YouTube channels, and they want to see blood sports, and they want to see people yelling at each other. I despise that stuff. I think it doesn't get us anywhere. I think if anything, I think it's counterproductive.
No, I get that. I also worry though that sometimes the more calm conversations are about the topics that they're not the important topics necessarily. And so
I agree. I also want to say, look, I am not going to be. I've commented on this before. I do think that the norms in academic circles lean in many cases so heavily towards being tepid and unwilling to be combative. I actually think that's a bad thing too. Philosophers it's not just philosophers, it's people in debates. You can lean too much in either direction. And people could be too unwilling to hold someone's feet to the fire. They could be too unwilling to press someone with a criticism. They could be too unwilling to criticize genuinely bad behavior that they could prove is bad. And all of that is bad. I think people should be a little more fierce.
That's why your conversation with Richard Brown was so interesting, because there was this certain amount of combativeness that was engaging and entertaining enough to keep it somewhat different to usual academic discussions, and it was overly done, so it would just turn out into some kind of rumble, basically.
Yeah, that was a little that first half of that discussion was a little unpleasant for me. I didn't enjoy that. I don't know what that was about.
Really?
Why, but you saw that it mellowed out, and we ended up having a better rapport, I think, in the latter half of that conversation.
Mm-hmm.
And the one thing I could say is I've seen Richard Brown in other conversations. He's often really chill, but sometimes he's a little combative, and sometimes he's a little blunt and direct with people, and honestly a little abrasive. I actually like that. I like a willingness to be abrasive. I don't like when people, and I find that I think I've overcorrected too much in the opposite direction. I think there's cases where I should be a little more abrasive. So I actually found that it was a little unpleasant at the time to experience, but I also understand and respect a willingness to exhibit that kind of personality in a discussion. So I actually quite like that he was a little combative with me. Great. So that was, I think, Goldilocks zone. It was a healthy level of combativeness.
Yeah, pretty much. Yeah.
Good. So yeah, I am in favor of that. I haven't had anything on my channel or other channels where I thought that it went terrible. There's cases where I've been frustrated by at my own performance, but other than that, I've had pretty fine interactions when I'm on camera. I have had a lot of much more unpleasant interactions in text, and I think there's something. I don't think that's a coincidence. I don't think it's just a difference in who I'm talking to. I think it's the format. A lot of people, if they are being a jerk in text, you get them on video and then they're fine.
Yeah, most likely.
I also think psychologically it's interesting. I think someone's views can come across as more intelligent in text than they would in a live discussion. Now, in fairness, sometimes that could be based upon the debate skills of a person. And I do feel bad for people who you can tell are very intelligent, but they're maybe not the greatest public speakers. So I do feel for that. I do feel bad for it. But at the same time, I do think sometimes a live discussion format can kind of maybe give some real perspective on, this argument doesn't sound so compelling when there's not so many big words in a text versus, when someone's trying to give some, I don't know. I think maybe, I don't know if anyone else agrees on that, but I think sometimes that can be the case where it's you can get unnecessarily swayed by jargon through text. Maybe someone's just really good at the way that they write. Their writing style is fantastic. But then maybe in a conversation, you realize, maybe I was being swayed more by that, and when I think about it, there's not as much substance to this argument as I thought there was.
Yeah, I've seen quite a lot of that actually.
Yo, Lance, I think you should like find like some very like passionate Christian or like some other like religious dude or a woman for that sense that would be like some kind of version of divine command theory, and precisely the realist version of the divine command theory, because as I understand it, there is like a conceptual possibility for a divine command theory to be expressed in an anti-realist terms. Is that correct?
I think it's a tough case. I mean, you could just stipulate, hey, by divine command theory, I mean an account that could be construed in anti-realist terms.
Yeah, because like I've thought about that for some time, and I think I can like kind of see how it could be like pretty intelligible and like not a whole lot of like in some inconsistencies. But yeah, besides the point, I think you need to find like some like very passionate dude with like religious and like realist type of mathematical view that would be like really willing to like press on you, to just see like how might they go,
Yeah, that would be interesting. I'm certainly happy to talk to theist, moral realists that like ground like objective right and wrong in God's nature or something like that. There's also teleological accounts, which I don't think I've had any public discussion about. So there's a variety of theistic realist views that would be interesting to talk about.
Well, as far as the morality being grounded in God's nature, now, in fairness, it's really frustrating. I don't know if anyone else has had this experience where you come across philosophical considerations in an article and you can't find that article again. So, in fairness, I may be misremembering. I can't find the article. But I remember there being some philosophical pushback too, because that's kind of, I've heard a Craigian response like that, right? Where someone brings up the Euthy-Thrower dilemma, right? And then they say, okay, but we can say that morality is part of God's nature. Or they'll use the phrase, God is the good, whatever that may mean, but God is the good. And from what I've heard, there has been philosophical pushback being that this is kicking the can down the road, so to speak. And then you could just ask the question, is something objectively moral because it's grounded in God's nature, or is it objectively moral and then it just so happens that God's nature is that way as well? And so in a sense, you can kind of levy a dilemma that way. And you could just say, okay, well, I'm just defining morality as that which is God's nature. But at the same time, you could still ask questions like, well, what if God's nature was this way? Or what if God's nature was such that killing babies for fun was something that his nature approved of? Would that make it okay?
Yeah, they're going to have a response to that, though, which they would just say that the question is nonsense because God is necessarily good.
Yeah, but that's like just a really kind of blunt response. It's basically like all comes down to the good old Euthy-Thrower dilemma, basically, which was expressed like fucking, I don't know, like 2,500 years ago or something like that.
But Lance, in saying that God's nature necessarily is good, aren't you just saying that nature is what defines goodness? Because I don't think that
they might end up in this like circular issue.
Yeah, so it's like
they might have some
response. Yeah,
they might have, so they could give some account of their moral epistemology where like there's reasons why they have access to a plausible set of moral facts, and like they might say, okay, it's an epistemic possibility that like it's consistent with goodness to hurt babies or whatever. But they might say, look, it's not like conditional on me actually being right about the substantive normative content of what it means to have a good nature. That's not actually logically possible. So they might hold like that the current set of moral facts like that they're approximating like actually are necessary facts. And I've heard realists say that they think that the moral facts are necessary. Now they're not saying whatever the moral facts happen to be are necessary. They're saying the particular set of moral facts that are the actual moral facts, those are the necessary facts. And so they're not going to buy any claim like, what if God, thought it was.
Yeah, I think it's just important to keep track of the dialectic, right? Because someone could say, a theist could say, God is a necessary being, and by that I mean it is not possible in any way, shape, or form that reality could be otherwise. But I don't think most theists think that. Like they might, maybe some really dogmatic ones too, but they might think, hey, listen, I give like a 10% chance to like atheism being true or whatever, and I give like a 90% chance to theism being true or something like that. And if you were to say that, like, so maybe you've come to maybe you're 90% convinced that that God's nature as it is and being good necessarily had to be the case, but you're 90% convinced. It's like, okay, but how relevant is that you're 90% convinced that God necessarily that God as his nature is, was necessary to begin with? It's like, I think epistemic possibilities are very, very relevant in these discussions.
They're relevant for some considerations, but not others. So they could still say like conditional on my view being correct. So, you just have to make sure that you're not equivocating between the modalities and that you're not mixing up epistemic possibility with logical possibility. And sure, but then, I could grant all sorts of stuff as like epistemically possible that looks to me like conditional on my current views being correct. It's like literally impossible, like logically impossible. Like I'm even willing to say like, hey, it's epistemically possible that, and then like, there's square circles or something like that. Because like, what if some dialetheist position is true and like actually contradictions can be true? Am I going to just say that cannot be true? Period. I wouldn't say that. So
right, but you
I think
greater or lesser credence.
I'm just saying I'm not going to be so dogmatic about these sorts of things.
No, and that's fine. Like I think it's fine not to be dogmatic about it, but it's. I think I lost my train of thought on that, but yeah, it's just weird for me because I think just appealing to. So it's good to your point. You mentioned logical impossibility, or whatever, but I don't think that the theist would say that something else other than God, as we conceive of him, necessarily existing. I don't think they would say that. It's logically impossible that something else could be the case. I don't think they'd say logically possible. They might say metaphysically speaking, it might be metaphysically impossible. But to me, that's, I don't know how useful that is. I guess you should say, like, metaphysically, it is the case, but it seems much weaker than saying I find on my current views that something other than God being the case is logically impossible. Like that to me is way different than saying it's metaphysically impossible.
Sure. Yeah. I don't know. What I would have to do is just talk to some theists that hold these sorts of views and see what they say. So I'm certainly open to doing that. If you want to help me find some, feel free. I'm currently talking to a few that I might end up having discussions with. I did try to have a couple conversations on TikTok. That didn't work out. So maybe I'll have some in the future. I think I might want to start wrapping things up. We're approaching the 3-hour mark. 3-hour mark. I don't know if anybody has any last remarks. I got my words mixed up there. So does anyone have anything they want to add? I know some of you have been here and you haven't said anything. So I want to give you the opportunity to do that. I'm probably not going to initiate a new topic and talk for another hour, but any other comments or anything?
Yeah, maybe I can take it like back to the discussion about like accusing people of being like dishonest. I would rather like imply the tactic, especially like regarding moral realists, instead of accusing them of being dishonest. We can actually say that they are being like they basically imply some kind of wishful thinking. Let's just say, because they're like inflating their ontology. And when it comes to the arguments, let's say that they use an argument from moral convergence, or like from some like categorical universalist principle, or from some kind of like intuitionist, some kind of principle. Like in all of those type of arguments, like basically I see a common thread between them. There is like a hidden premise in all of those arguments, which is like implicit, but they do not say it explicitly. So the premise, the hidden premise, is that by like using that argument, I'm also hoping that like somehow it kind of tracks the moral facts, like by some kind of like method or like virtue or some kind of like faculty in my brain. And like basically I just don't see, like, until they show me how all of those like arguments could actually like be tracking those like objective moral facts. I'm basically saying that you're like inflating your ontology, you're being unparsimonious. And if we agree on some like epistemic virtues which are present in science, just to establish like a common ground, and if we establish this like common epistemic virtue between us, which is a parsimony, do not inflate your ontology, basically. Then if we agree on those grounds, I can basically say, well, you're being like you're implying wishful thinking, you know, and like by meeting on this like common ground, that may be like one of the methods how can we like basically agree on some points, even though we're coming from different like mathematical positions and we have different intuitions. And it's also like, I think it's very useful to think about intuitions. Let's say that we have a mathematical function which lends like illustrated in like default settings, and we can think about like evidence, which says to us like how reasonable or like how justified the person may be, is like a not a constant, but like a variable which you put in that function, and the outcome of the function would be basically be like how would that person respond to the same evidence, counting the fact that they have like different priors, different instances, and like different default quote unquote views. So that's how I would put it.
Yeah, so I mean, this is going to be the case for any type of dispute where, if you say, "Hey, do you agree with me that parsimony is a relevant factor in considering the comparative merits of different theories?" Yes, okay, and then you could maybe convince someone that realism is less parsimonious than an anti-realist account, and that, all else being equal, counts in favor of anti-realism. You might even be able to persuade realists of that, and then they would just think there's other like they just say all else isn't equal though.
Yeah.
And then they have other sets of moves that they might make. Some might just reject parsimony, and then you don't agree on this foundational stuff, or they might agree and then argue that it is equally, or it's equally parsimonious, or it's it's actually more parsimonious. I don't see how they would do that, but they might. So there's a number of moves they could make, and they probably would just make those moves. But yeah, pretty much in any case, if you can find common ground, then that can help with making progress. I haven't found saying, because like it's something I say about realism is it strikes me as superfluous. I don't think there's any facts or observations that it seems needed to account. Like there's nothing I observe that I think it needs to account for. What I need to account for is why some people think it's true. If nobody did, I don't think I wouldn't see any particularly good reason to think it's true. So pretty much the main thing going forward is that some people think it's true, which isn't saying much. It's like for me, it's in the same ballpark as like Bigfoot. It's probably less because I could really work out their standards for like what would actually convince me Bigfoot's real. Realism's in, I think, a much worse position. So there's that. That if you could find common ground, that's going to help you. But parsimony might be one of those considerations. But when I presented parsimony considerations to realists, it hasn't seemed to have gotten me very far. Like they just, I mean, one of the things they could say is your account fails to account for so. One thing that really seems to be a disagreement between myself and realists is that some of them almost treat it as, maybe this is too uncharitable. Some of them will say things that seem to indicate that they see what there is to explain to be the moral facts, and it's almost like they're starting the conversation thinking that there's okay. So you're going to have at least some that say we have immediate access to certain kinds of moral facts, and this would at least be like the what is that sense of? Give me a second.
Direct
the intuitionist.
No. Here it is. Yeah, I thought so. The feeling of value, and that's Sharon Hewitt Roulette. And I've seen some realists praise this book and speak very highly of it. And what Roulette effectively argues is that like one of the things that we have direct access to is like qualia that immediately allow us to apprehend objective goodness and badness. And so, boom, you just perceive it. Like there's redness to my red, there's goodness to my happiness. And so like one of the things to explain is the fact itself. I mean, there's not, you would have to get more, you'd have to say, you're wrong about your own qualia, or you're wrong that there are qual. Like it would be tricky to argue against
Yeah.
this view because it's beginning with so many presumptions in its favor, which isn't to say that it has to be wrong.
but then
I
we
actually
can
think this
just-
is an interesting way to approach the issue.
Then we can just ask like, okay, so you have this like qualitative experience of like perceiving good, and let's just like go like one move or one step deeper. Like, how did you came up like with this qualitative experience? Like presuming you're not lying, of course. And like to me, like it seems to be like the most plausible explanation given the data on hand. That like just like our like common evolutionary history, the fact that we live in a society, the fact that like cooperation is like one of the like most valuable things in the evolution for the survival of species, the fact that we have like different social institutions that we have to keep up, the fact that we have to like basically all of those stuff. I think like those are more plausible explanations for why are you having that qualitative experience, which is like true and you're reporting it correctly, you're not lying, than like some possibility of you like tracking in some relevant sense the objective moral like reality, let's just call it that.
I agree, and that's the case that needs to get made, that like you need to present, like for me, I don't like evolutionary debunking arguments because I think it's like evolution influenced your moral judgments and attitudes and values and dispositions. Okay, but more than just evolution did. I think I would appeal to like, I think culture plays a big factor here. And
but like culture like grows out of the evolution,
Sure,
Yeah, I would argue that as well.
they're in a dynamic interplay. So evolution has shaped how culture works. So like natural selection favored us being a species that relies on cumulative cultural evolution to like adapt to environments. And so you have, I tend to favor like the Richardson-Boyd approach, the gene culture co-evolutionary approaches. And so I think that they're in a persistent dynamic exchange with one another. So yeah, sure. No, I agree with you. I just think a lot of the evolutionary debunking arguments seem a little crude, and they're just like evolution, as if you have a little moral center in the brain or something. They're not that crude. But yeah, I think that there's going to be some story we tell that like it might start as a just so story. And Dennett has commented on this, like, explanations start as just so stories. But if we can marshal enough evidence to show, look, we can give a causal explanation of why you would report or why it seems to you that realism is true, that can account for that report without positing that it's true, that I think would undermine the justification for believing it's true. It's just that one,
agreed,
a comprehensive and compelling version of that account has been offered, and two, I think you'd have a devil of a time actually convincing realists that, because it would be very similar, given the phenomenology, like the way realism presents itself to many, especially non-naturalist realists. Maybe it'd be less so for naturalist realists. The way it presents it to themselves phenomenologically, it's like if they're currently looking at it. And now, so in other words, showing that it's not real is like trying to convince someone that they're hallucinating. And they're like, look, I can see the elephant. You're like, look, I'm telling you, we got their scan of your brain and the scan of the objects over there. There's no elephant over there. Your brain is projecting an elephant. There isn't an elephant. And a person might look at it and go, I'm sorry. It's so obvious there's an elephant there that all the brain scans in the world aren't going to convince me otherwise. I think we might be dealing with a situation like that. I think realists, in some cases, may be effectively incorrigible. And I don't think that might sound really bad and critical of realism. It is not. I might be incorrigible. I might be incorrigibly stuck as an atheist. I don't know what would convince me that God exists. I have no idea. Maybe I couldn't be convinced. And that would be a bad thing if I couldn't be convinced and there was a God, and there was evidence that there was a God. That would be bad. Like, so I'm not saying this is distinctive to realism. I want to make a general point. I think that many people, the facts driving us to develop and hold on to our beliefs are not that responsive to arguments or evidence. And I think this is true of me, and I think it's true of other people. And maybe we're just not pushed and pulled by arguments as much as we think we are.
Yeah.
And a bunch of other factors are our beliefs. And so I think maybe a philosophy might be a big empty puppet show that's largely epiphenomenal on the factors that are actually driving belief change.
Yeah, and I guess I'll make my last comment on this point then. So it's funny, when I think of evolutionary debunking arguments, I do think of it in the sense that I think that you were talking about, where there are these other factors that can explain our moral intuitions that do not rely upon moral intuitions, in fact, being the case. And I think it gets back to this idea of incorrigibility. You know, I agree with you in the sense, well, not just incorrigibility, that we are not as open to arguments as we might think that we are, and that our beliefs and intuitions aren't open to revision as much as we might think they are. I think that is true, but at least when it comes to theism, right? Like maybe we might not think that there is evidence such that my mind could be changed, but we might be able to hypothetically come up with evidence that, at least as far as we can tell, we think we might be convinced that like theism is true if we did come across such evidence. So I think that's useful. And to your point on parsimony, right? I think this gets back to Morean foot stomping, right? So a moral realist could even grant that it is the case, generally speaking, that parsimony is a factor in favor of one theory over another theory. Like they could grant that, but they could go to their Morean foot stomping and say, but yet my intuitions about moral facts are so strong that nonetheless I am convinced by that over the yeah. So one could still make even though, and they could still say, even though I grant, generally speaking, but because this intuition is so strong, I just don't think that parsimony is enough to overcome that. And so why I think where this gets to is just, but is it relevant to bring up that parsimony point for a public discussion? My answer would be yes, because it's perhaps the case that other people would be convinced that parsimony, that maybe they say, yeah, I think parsimony is really important, and I don't think my intuitions about moral facts are so strong to overcome that. And to my point about like the interviewing example, one reason why you bring up, I think Daniel Dennett calls these things like intuition pumps, right? Or we can bring up things, and Lance is right. In most cases, I think, I even hate when people say, you know, what moves can you make? It's almost thinking that, okay, what can I think of as a move that I can still maintain my position, right? So it's kind of weird even mentioning things in that kind of way. You know, what moves can you make? But it just might be the case that even though you bring that up publicly, maybe it can be convincing, but privately speaking, it really isn't. And I can say from my own personal experience that there's definitely times where I've been making arguments, and then I go back and I look at them and I'm like, you know what? I maybe was being a little too dogmatic, or I was acting a little bit more confidently than I should have. And I feel bad about that. And I try to do better for next time. And one marker I keep in my life is if someone calls me out on something and I feel like I'm wrong, am I willing to admit, you know what? I think I made a mistake in what I stated. I think actually a better way of putting it would be, and that's kind of a marker in my life, being like, am I just constantly dogmatically in favor of every little stupid thing I say? Or am I open to correction? Am I open to revision? But I think generally speaking, yeah, belief revision is hard. There's all sorts of biases that are not working in our favor, and we just have to do the best we can, I guess.
All right. I think that's a good place to wrap up. We do the best we can. I'm going to close things out there. Thank you for all the guests that are currently here. So you could head out, or so I'm going to make some final remarks for people. So,
all right, Lance, thanks for the conversation. It was nice.
It was a lot of fun. And thank you for everybody that's watching this later that was a guest. Thank you as well for being here. So I will see you all later. And see you later. All right. So thank you all for being here. Appreciate it. That was a lot of fun. So I am back. I will be streaming again. This isn't just some one-off anomaly where I stream once and then I go back to being silent and gone for months. I'm going to be doing this regularly. I have stuff coming up. I have a scheduled event for Monday. I have a scheduled event for Friday. So I already have 2 for next week. There are a few people where I'm going to have to do a bit of reading and research before I bring them on, because I'm going to be pushing into new topics. It's going to be a bit more work for me, but I want to do it. I'm getting around, the break is over and I'm turning my attention to that. There was a few things, when I got back to work that I had to take care of, but I'm going to be turning my attention to doing more research and pushing into new topics and not just talking about metaethics all the time. But you'll always be getting a healthy dose of metaethics. That's not going away. So we'll be doing metaethics. We'll be doing consciousness. We'll be doing free will. We'll be doing artificial intelligence stuff. I want to bring in some of that stuff. I don't know if I've talked about this much, but I've always had, well, not always, but for a long time, I've had an interest in effective altruism and long-termism and transhumanism and the artificial intelligence and existential risk stuff. And so I'll be talking about a little bit of that. That's going to be a place where I really need to brush up on stuff and do some more reading, because I got real rusty on that. It's not stuff that I've touched in years. So that's an area I'm going to push into. What else? I'm going to be getting into more meta science stuff. So I'm going to be talking about more about my concerns with peer review and academia. So all of those things, and experimental philosophy more generally, maybe some psych method stuff more generally. We might talk about measurement stuff because that's a big interest of mine. So we will see. And maybe, what I'm really open to is things that aren't on those lists. Like that's all the stuff that I liked before I got in dissertation land for several years. So there might be new things that are coming in. What I can say is I have mixed feelings. I'm a little ambivalent, but the more I see all these discussions on religion and philosophy of religion, the more some of that looks of interest to me. So I might push a little bit into that. I doubt there's so much to know there, and it's so comprehensive. I don't know if I'm never going to be any kind of specialist or expert in those topics. So you're always going to get better content from people that really specialize in that kind of thing. So like Joe Schmid, Majesty of Reason channel, amazing content. So check that out. There's just going to be specialists in topics that I'll be a generalist in at best. If not just someone just poking their head in there to see what's up with that topic. So there's going to be topics like that I may, bring someone on, talk about religion or something. So, because it's interesting. And then another big area for me that's of interest is language and language cognition. That stuff is interesting to me. So we will see where things go. Let's see. What are the upcoming topics? The upcoming topics is more meta-ethics in the near term, but there'll be new stuff soon on other topics as well. And again, the blog stuff, I'll probably do a stream where I focus on some of what I've talked about in the blog, and that's experimental philosophy methods, and that's about consciousness. So it's like experimental philosophy that is focused on you can see the first blog post where you see I'm introducing the topic. And that's the question of, philosophers have this notion of phenomenal consciousness. It's like the notion of consciousness of like where we have qualia, where there's something it's like to have our experiences. It's the kind that is motivating the hard problem of consciousness, that there's certain features or aspects or properties of conscious experience that they don't seem amenable to empirical inquiry, and they don't seem really touchable by science. That doesn't mean that they necessarily aren't. The hard problem is how do we account for these? How do we explain this? How do we address this? Given it looks really hard. It looks like there's these certain sorts of things we're trying to account for that seem to have resisted being accounted for in third personal scientific terms so far. And so maybe they can, maybe they can't be, and that's what's supposed to be the hard problem. Now I'm in the camp that there isn't really a hard problem of consciousness, but pretty controversial view. Anyway, the question is, do non-philosophers have a concept of phenomenal consciousness, or does it seem to them like they have qualia, or that there's something it's like to be them? Some philosophers seem to me, from their remarks, to think that, yeah, pretty much this is something that's obvious to everybody. This is how everyone thinks. So there were a couple studies on this. There's Nobel Prince 2008, and then there's another study from 2014, I think, that seemed to find some evidence either that people have a similar concept or the same concept of phenomenal consciousness as philosophers. That's Nobel Prince. And then the other paper, I think, said like they do have a concept, but it's different in some ways than philosophers. So you have those, but subsequent research by Sisma and Mashri mostly argues that non-philosophers don't have a concept of phenomenal consciousness. And they've marshaled quite a bit of evidence. There's a few other people that have stepped into the fray and run some studies that are also now finding like negative evidence. They're finding evidence that appears to show that people don't have a concept of phenomenal consciousness. There's a more recent paper from 2022 that says that these studies are not valid. And so, in other words, it's showing they don't really show that people don't have the concept of phenomenal consciousness, which doesn't mean they do. It just means we don't know. And so what they argue is that the field is open. We don't know whether non-philosophers have a concept of phenomenal consciousness or not. I would say to a certain extent, I think that that's probably true. I think the studies probably haven't convincingly established things one way or another. But I think that there's good background and theoretical reasons to suspect they probably don't have any particular position at all. So I'll be talking about that on this channel. So you'll get some of that too. So some XPhi consciousness type stuff. XPhi, if you don't know, is an abbreviation for experimental philosophy. People in the field started calling it XPhi, and I'll put that in the chat. Looks like this. XPhi, you can put a dash. Oh, yeah, XPhi. So people have abbreviated it that way. So if you see me say XPhi or write that out, that's what I'm referring to, experimental philosophy. And I guess I'll talk about that another time. So thanks everybody for being here. Thank you for supporting me. So I am on TikTok now, if I haven't mentioned that. I have like 30, 40 videos over there. So you can find me over there or just look up Lance Independent. I'm sure you'll see me. Even if you just do a search for realism or anti-realism or moral anti-realism, whatever, you will find a bunch of videos from me. So I'm on there. I have currently 500 and something, like 520 followers. If I hit 1,000, I can do live streams on there. I know Danny from Phil Talk does this, where they go to YouTube at the same time. So I would be able to go on there and it's a really easy and effective way of getting lots of viewers and lots of people interacting. And I'd be able to talk to people on there and do that sort of thing. So I'm trying to hit 1,000 followers there. So feel free to go over and join TikTok, or if you're already there, follow me over there. So I am producing content there. It's short form content. The videos can't be longer than 10 minutes. And then, of course, I sometimes pop into streams over there. So if you follow me and you log in, you'll see if I'm currently talking, even on someone else's channel, you'll be able to see, oh, hey, Lance is talking to these people. So, in fact, I just did a conversation over there yesterday. So I'm over there on TikTok. I have a Discord. You could join the Discord. I've got like Patreon and other methods of supporting me if you want. I have a blog, which I've mentioned a few times. So I'm all over the place, and I'm going to be, I'm back. I'm active on all these places. So anyway, thanks so much for helping me hit 1,000 subscribers. Obviously, that's totally on you. So thanks so much for getting me there. And, it took a little over a year. I think it took a few extra days than a year because I started this about a year ago, right? I think so. I don't know. I think so. I'd have to check the exact day that I posted my first video. In fact, I could do that now. Let's do it. When was my first video? It's probably January something, 2023. I'm not going to look it up. No, I said I was. So let's find it. Okay, I'm going to do it. Sometimes I feel like I'm in a rush and I'm not. I know other people get way more chill in their lives. And I don't know. Okay, my first one, 1 year ago. Let's see. It's called the Free Will After Show. And that was January 7th. And when did I hit 1,000 subscribers? Let's see. I'm trying to find it. Looking it up. That was yesterday, looks like. So so it took about a year and 13 months. So I really want to hit, I want to double that this year at least. So my goal for this year is 3,000 subscribers. So maybe that's kind of a modest goal. I feel like the more you get subscribers you get, the more visibility you get, the faster you grow. I don't know if that's true. I'm assuming that's true. So hopefully I could grow, and maybe branching out from just meta ethics and 3-hour streams like this, we'll do that. The other thing I'm thinking about doing, because I've been talking to people and getting some feedback and tips on how to improve things, is not just doing 3 and 5 and 10 minute videos on TikTok, but also doing some shorter videos here. The other thing I was thinking about doing is porting some of that stuff over to YouTube, like some of the shorter videos. So I'm thinking about ways of growing the channel and just making this more than just me ranting about meta ethics every week. I'm going to keep working on that. So I'm going to have to sit down and brainstorm on other plans for the year. But anyway, thanks so much, everybody. And all right. So I will see you all next week, or probably sooner, actually, in the next few days. But I'll probably be back next week for just a regular casual stream too. And be ready to join in if you want to chat. I like to have a sense of what you want to talk about before you come up. So if you could do that, I'd appreciate that. But I thought things went okay today. So anyway, see y'all later. Take care.